Hi everyone, welcome to my channel, here to guide you today. Many of you use these videos to relax or drift off to sleep, so before we begin, please like and subscribe to the channel. By the way, where are you watching from, and what time is it? Now, settle in, get comfy, and let's begin. Story, you can't bluff now you. I let you in because I felt sorry for you, Richie. That's the truth, Jerry said, his voice dropping into a rare, almost sympathetic tone. I don't even need your money. I just felt sorry for you. And look what happened. Should I really be helping you dig yourself even deeper? I don't know, kid. Richie's eyes filled with tears. The desperation clawed at his throat, making his words stumble out in a gasp. Jerry, please, I've got to get it back. I lost everything I had. Come on, I'm good for it, I swear it on my mother. Please, Jerry's face hardened. 10 grand, he snapped, that's what you get. 5 ain't even worth me getting my ass up off this stool. You get 10, you give me 15. And count yourself lucky I don't make it 16 for being a pain in the ass. Got it? Sure, Jerry, Richie panted, hating the pleading tone in his own voice. He couldn't seem to control it. Yeah, sure, I get it. Thank you. Thank you so much. You won't regret this. Across the room, one of the other players chuckled. Whatever he loans this dingbat, it's going to be mine pretty soon. The man sneered, prompting a wave of laughter from the table. Big Jerry's scowl silenced them almost instantly. Can it, Vinny? Jerry barked. We don't use antagonistic language at my table. You know that. And you know what? I hope the kid cleans you out, teach you some manners. Jerry hauled himself off the stool and lumbered toward a storage closet. After rummaging around for a few moments, he returned with $10,000 in chips cradled in a nicotine-stained rack. He shoved it into Richie's hands, his tone turning grim. You take these to the table, and there ain't no turning back. You sure about this, kid? Oh, I'm sure, Richie growled, his desperation alchemizing into something sharper. He slammed the chip rack onto the table and declared, Let's play some cards, fellas. 45 minutes later, Richie found himself being escorted out the back door by Big Jerry, the older man's massive hand clamped firmly on his shoulder. Richie's mind was a haze. He wasn't sure if he was awake or trapped in some nightmarish fever dream. Surely he couldn't have destroyed himself this thoroughly, this quickly. It was insane. It couldn't be real. And yet, here he was. 7 days, Jerry said coldly, squeezing Richie's shoulder painfully. Be here by noon. Don't make me come looking for you, kid. And don't you dare show up with no money and a bunch of excuses. Richie opened his mouth to respond, but Jerry didn't give him the chance. The door swung shut with a loud, final clunk, leaving Richie staring blankly at the peeling paint. He stood there for a long moment, shivering in the icy wind, before finally shoving his hands into his empty pockets and trudging away. $15,000. How in the blue frozen hell was he supposed to come up with that kind of money in 7 days? Richie's mind raced as he walked, his chin tucked against the cold, his jacket collar pulled high. Robbery. That was a possibility. What else was he going to do? Play the stock market? But bank robbery was too risky, and convenience stores wouldn't yield enough. He'd have to hit dozens of them to come close to the amount he needed. Maybe theft wasn't the answer. He could pawn his .38 special and take the money to the racetrack, but that was no guarantee. There were always slot machines too, but no, that was idiotic. Slot machines? Are you stupid or something? Richie muttered aloud, shaking his head. A bank job was out of the question. A convenience store? Pointless. So, what then? What was left? His spiraling thoughts were interrupted by a voice from his memory, gravelly and slurred as though its owner had been drunk, and shouting over loud music. It's near the corner of Ambassador and 3rd Avenue. Weird little place sells drum catchers and fake shrunken heads. The voice belonged to Dallas, a guy Richie had met years ago during a stint in juvenile detention. Dallas was a car thief with a cocaine habit and a penchant for sleazy strip clubs like the Blue Review. He'd been the one to mention the easy score. I know someone who knows someone, Dallas had said, his voice tinged with the kind of reckless excitement that only came with bad ideas. "There's a safe in the guy's office. Mad stacks of cash, jewelry, rare coins, you name it. The dude who runs the place, weird as hell but harmless. Old guy, always alone. It'd be easy, man. I'm telling you, easy." Richie hadn't taken the story seriously at the time. But now, as the icy wind bit at his face and the weight of his situation pressed down on him, the idea didn't seem so far-fetched. Easy money, mad stacks. He could use that right about now. It would be so easy. Richie muttered to himself, "Mad stacks. I could use some mad stacks right about now." The idea of paying off his debt and maybe even coming out ahead lit a small, desperate spark in his mind. "Or I'm going to have to learn how to wipe my ass with my feet," he added bitterly. He knew the place in Uncharted Waters, near the corner of Ambassador and 3rd. Dallas had said there was a safe full of cash, jewels, and rare collectibles inside. Items that Jerry Cannella would happily accept as payment. The thought of actually coming out ahead after paying Jerry made Richie's heart race. Maybe this wasn't just about survival. Maybe this was his chance to turn things around. "This has to be real," he yelled into the cold night air. "You better not have been bullshitting me, you crackhead." A group of rough-looking young men walking past swiveled their heads to glare at Richie. One of them snapped, "Is you talking about?" Richie froze, casting his eyes down at the sidewalk and muttering, "That's a really good question, man. A really good question." He hurried off into the thickening gloom, heading home to fetch his .38 special from the bedside table. Uncharted Waters was a cluttered hole-in-the-wall shop crammed with bizarre and seemingly worthless junk. The single room was packed to the ceiling with oddities, necklaces made from mummified animal parts, incomplete mannequins, old movie posters, used clothing, moldy books about witchcraft, and candles of all shapes and sizes. The sheer volume of items was overwhelming, almost disorienting. The proprietor was a gaunt, stooped old man who introduced himself stiffly, Neville Rawlings, proprietor and a confirmed explorer of Uncharted Waters. "Here, have a matchbook." Even with his pronounced stoop, Neville stood several inches taller than Richie, who was just shy of 6'1". Dressed in a forbidding black suit and a dark red tie, Neville looked like a sinister funeral director straight out of a vintage horror movie. "You're in luck, sir," Neville said. "I was just about to close for the night. Are you looking for anything in particular?" He steepled his long fingers together in a solicitous manner and waited. Richie absently shook his head. "No, sir. Just wanted to look around." His attention was caught by a locked display case on the front counter. Inside, there was only one item, the most unusual deck of cards Richie had ever seen. The backs were adorned with intricate patterns and characters, black text swirling over a vivid red background. The figures seemed to shift and undulate as he stared, creating a mesmerizing optical illusion. "These cards are something else," Richie said. "I've never seen anything like that before." "What's the lettering? Do you know what language it's in?" "I have no idea, sir," Neville replied. "And I don't believe anyone has ever tried to find out. No one knows but Travis Tanner, the man who commissioned this work of art, and possibly the artist himself. A troubled young fellow, as I recall, but quite talented. Tragically, he took his own life shortly after completing these cards. As the story goes, he broke into a botanical garden and hanged himself from a Judas tree." Richie nodded mechanically, muttering, "Wow, that's crazy." He tried to appear engaged, but his mind was elsewhere. This wasn't a casual visit for him. Richie had never robbed anyone before. He wasn't a stick-up man, he was just an unlucky gambler and a mediocre card shark. His nerves were screaming, and his hand gripped the .38 in his jacket pocket so tightly that his knuckles ached. All he could think was, "I could get 10 years for armed robbery. That's big boy jail, not county lockup. I wouldn't last a week. I wouldn't even want to." Meanwhile, Neville continued, oblivious to Richie's internal turmoil. "Those cards have passed through the hands of some of the most notorious villains of modern times," he said with a wistful air. Richie barely heard him. His heart was pounding as he weighed the risk and the reward. The safe was here somewhere, just like Dallas had said. This could be his chance to settle his debt and maybe, just maybe, start over. But the enormity of what he was about to do loomed over him like a dark cloud. The longer he stood there, the heavier the weight of the decision became. Neville plowed on, seemingly oblivious to Richie's sweaty forehead and twitchy demeanor. Travis Tanner was a gambler of great infamy. Neville continued, his tone growing more theatrical. He ran in infamous circles John Dillinger, members of the Barker clan, senators, mayors, police chiefs, judges, mafioso, and business magnates. Many powerful and dangerous people, and every single one of them lost. No one could beat Travis Tanner's cards. No one. No one? Richie asked, his voice small and papery. He wasn't feeling so hot. In fact, he felt like he might actually pass out and collapse onto the grimy, yellowed floor tiles. He should have just burst in with a ski mask and fired a shot into the ceiling charged and fast and gotten the job done. Why had he decided to play it cool and scope out the room first? There was nothing here but one elderly, Vincent Price-looking dude and piles of junk. What had he been expecting? Navy SEALs. He could have been gone by now. Neville went on. His opponents often said, "You can't bluff Travis Tanner." The cards were never marked, Mr. Gold. Yet, Travis Tanner always knew when to call, when to hold, and when to fold. He was unbeatable, Richie snorted. If he was cleaning everyone out like that, it had to be a loaded deck. No one has that kind of luck. Neville offered a sly, enigmatic smile, picking up an ornate letter opener from the counter and fingering its sharp tip absently. Perhaps. There were rumors that Travis Tanner was deeply interested in the occult automatic writing, seances, things of that nature. He was an intimidating man, tall and cloaked in black. Even the most ruthless gangsters feared him at least a little. No one ever dared to rob him of his winnings, which, coincidentally, is exactly why you're here, isn't it? Mr. Gold. Richie froze, doing a double take. He gaped at the old man before his hand jerked into his pocket, pulling out the gun. The safe. Take me to the safe, and you won't get hurt. Safe? Neville repeated with a dry, mirthless chuckle. He seemed entirely unfazed by the weapon. There is no safe. My only possession of real value is this deck of cards. They are priceless. I cannot allow them to fall into your hands. They were bestowed upon me by Travis Tanner himself on his deathbed. I will certainly not allow them to be stolen by a lowly scoundrel such as you, Richie grimaced. Do as I say, old man, or you'll get hurt. Oh, I believe we'll both get hurt, Neville growled, his arm lashing out with alarming speed. He shoved the gun aside and swung the letter opener in the same motion. Richie jerked back, narrowly avoiding having his throat slashed. The next swing caught him across the forehead, leaving a thin red line that immediately began oozing blood. Richie staggered backward, firing a shot wildly. The bullet shattered a ceramic vase behind Neville, but the old man didn't flinch. He lunged at Richie again, thrusting the letter opener in rapid, sewing machine-like motions. Richie stumbled, tripping over a pile of junk and falling hard onto the floor. The gun slipped from his grasp, skittering out of reach. Neville pounced like a bird of prey. It's closing time, Mr. Gold, he screeched, his face alight with a maniacal grin. Richie wrestled with all his might to keep the blade from plunging into his chest. The old man was deceptively strong, his movements eerily fast, and his eyes gleamed with a bloodthirsty rage. I'll put you with the rest of them, Neville panted. You'll be in fine company very soon, Mr. Gold. He bore down on Richie, forcing the blade closer and closer. Richie bucked wildly, twisting his head to avoid the weapon. The letter opener grazed his neck, leaving a shallow cut, and stuck into the floor with a muted thunk. In desperation, Richie turned his head and sank his teeth into Neville's hand, biting down with feral intensity. Neville howled in pain, trying to wrench his hand free, but Richie bit harder. With one final, violent buck of his hips, Richie threw Neville off balance, sending him sprawling to the side. Richie kicked out with both legs, landing a solid blow to the old man's gut. and scrambled across the floor on his hands and knees to retrieve his gun. "Here I come, child," Neville bellowed, his voice full of malice. "Here I come to rip out your eyes." The old man closed the distance with that same eerie fluidity, his speed belying his age. Richie rolled onto his back, the gun in a two-handed grip, and screamed as he squeezed the trigger 3 times. 3 deafening explosions shattered the tense silence. The storefront windows shivered as Neville collapsed beside Richie, a gurgling sound escaping his lips. Richie scooted away on his rear, panting heavily. Neville lay curled on his side, coughing up a grotesque mixture of blood and mucus. His glassy eyes locked onto Richie's, and his lips moved silently, but Richie could read them clearly. "I'll see you soon, Mr. Gold." Neville's body went limp, his expression frozen in hatred. Richie's arms trembled as he lowered the gun, his forehead slick with blood and sweat. He wiped his face with a sleeve, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "What the hell, oh man, what the?" The weight of what had just happened came crashing down on Richie like a grand piano. He let out a keening sob, doubling over as a wave of nausea overtook him. Vomit splattered across the blood-streaked floor tiles. He wiped his mouth with a shaking hand and whispered to himself, "I gotta bounce." Staggering to his feet, Richie took one last look at the wreckage before stumbling out into the night. Richie wiped more blood from his eyes with his shirt and staggered through the chaotic mess left by his life-or-death struggle with the homicidal shopkeeper. His mind reeled as he searched for the door to the back room, the supposed home of the fabled safe. According to Dallas, the coked-out car thief, the safe could magically solve all of Richie's rapidly snowballing problems in one fell swoop. At the back of the shop, Richie found 3 doors. The first revealed a musty little bathroom with a profoundly rust-stained toilet. Behind the second, he discovered an equally musty broom closet filled with cleaning supplies. Desperation clawed at him. "Come on, baby," Richie begged the last door, his voice cracking as tears pricked his eyes. "Come on, come on, come on." He opened the third door to find a small, cluttered office. Throwing his head back, Richie let out a triumphant howl before tearing into the room like a whirlwind. Papers, books, and random junk flew everywhere as he ransacked the space. Panic began to build when he couldn't find the safe. He ripped gaping holes in the drywall, hoping to uncover a hidden wall safe, but it wasn't there. The truth hit him like a punch to the gut. The safe didn't exist. Dallas was full of it. Richie screamed, hurling an antique snow globe against the wall. It shattered into countless fragments. "You dummy, he's a freaking cokehead. What did you expect?" Richie ran back into the main showroom, making a beeline for the exit. He cursed at himself for being such a colossal idiot. He shoved the door open and stepped outside, but then froze in his tracks. Neville's words echoed in his mind. "It is priceless." Richie hesitated, his face twisting with conflicting emotions, before turning back inside. His hands trembled as he approached the counter, raising the butt of the .38 and smashing open the display case. The deck of cards inside felt strangely warm as he picked it up. Richie shoved the cards into his pocket, cast a final glance at Neville's lifeless body on the floor, and bolted into the night. The cut on Richie's neck wasn't too bad, but the gaping wound on his forehead was another story. Back in his cramped apartment, he rooted through an ancient first aid kit and patched himself up with mildewed medical tape. He knew it would leave a nasty scar, but he didn't care. Once bandaged, Richie sat at his kitchen table, the naked bulb overhead casting harsh light on the deck of cards. Under the light, Richie noticed something odd. The dense symbols and characters on the backs of the cards were identical on every single one. The design was mesmerizing, a marvel of artistic precision. "No wonder the guy killed himself," Richie muttered. This would have driven anyone nuts. The face cards were even more disturbing. The jacks looked like they were in the final stages of a necrotic disease, their eyes glinting with madness, and their faces riddled with raw, gaping holes where their noses once were. The queens were pale, vampiric beauties with ghostly white skin and pointed canines, exuding both allure and menace. The kings, on the other hand, had a wild, animalistic appearance. Their matted hair and bushy beards hinted at pointed ears beneath their crowns, giving them a sly, Wolf-like demeanor. The Jokers were the most unsettling of all. One was a grotesque depiction of the Grim Reaper in a jester's outfit, its mummified skull leering beneath a fool's cap. The other showed a prisoner in a striped uniform, sobbing as he performed a barefoot shuffle, seemingly for the amusement of unseen jailers. "This is creepy as hell," Richie murmured. The unsettling artistry extended even to the numbered cards and suits, which were drawn with a primal, talismanic quality, as if they belonged to an ancient, forgotten age. Despite their eerie appearance, the cards felt perfect in Richie's hands. They danced effortlessly between his fingers as he shuffled and dealt. It was almost as if they had a life of their own. Richie dealt a hand of 7-card stud to invisible opponents, ending up with a full house, jacks over kings. He whistled. "Well, damn, let's try her again." Another shuffle. This time, he dealt himself for 9s with a queen as the kicker. On the next hand, to pair, kings and aces. Richie stared at the cards, shaking his head in amazement. The proof was right there in front of him. These cards could make him unbeatable. If he could somehow convince a dealer to use this deck in a game, Richie knew he'd dominate. He'd clean house every single time. A grin spread across his face as the possibilities unfurled before him. "Marvelous," Richie whispered. The cards were his ticket to the big time, his escape from the hole he had dug himself into. All he had to do was play them right. The cards were incredibly the best thing to ever happen to Richie Gold in his entire miserable life. But there was something about them that felt off. They were disturbingly warm to the touch, a sensation that reminded Richie of the phrase "warm as freshly spilled blood." He shook his head, pushing the thought away. No, thank you. He didn't need to go down that road. Still, he couldn't help but wonder, if these cards were as old and well-used as Neville had claimed, why were they in such pristine condition? They looked untouched, as though they had never been handled without gloves, let alone tossed across grimy tables in smoky backrooms. It made no sense, and the thought unsettled him. Richie spread the cards out in a fan on the table and stared at them, lost in thought. "I'd always win," he muttered to the empty kitchen. "Every single hand. No one could beat me." The idea was intoxicating. The cards could change everything. He thought about pawning the .38 to scrape together a little extra cash. It was a smart move. After all, the gun was now tied to a murder investigation. He knew a fence who wouldn't ask questions and would pay cash on the spot. With that money and the cards, Richie could hit a table somewhere and clean house. But there was a catch. How would he ever convince a dealer to use his deck? They'd think something was off, and they'd be right, or would they? Richie's gaze drifted to the intricate symbols on the back of the cards. What if that was their purpose? He chuckled nervously. "Well, underscore, it's a spell," he murmured. "An incantation. Some kind of black magic voodoo. Makes it so no one notices anything is wrong." The more he thought about it, the more it made sense. It had to be. To calm his nerves, Richie downed a couple of beers and forced himself to eat the last of his leftover lo mein. Afterward, he grabbed another beer for courage, shrugged on his ratty coat, and tugged a hat low over his forehead. He glanced at himself in the cracked mirror by the door and saw a wreck of a man with a sordid past and haunted eyes staring back at him. "Time to change that," Richie muttered. "Golden Richie, let's live up to the name." He tucked the cards into his pocket, said a silent prayer to anyone who might be listening, and stepped out into the night to find himself a game. It was shockingly easy to get people to use the cards. All Richie had to do was put the deck on the table and say, "We're using these tonight." Everyone would glance at the cards and respond, "Yeah, sure, whatever," as if they were hypnotized. No one noticed the grotesque details of the cards, the syphilitic jacks, the vampiric queens, or the wild, feral kings. It was as if the true appearance of the cards was obscured by a mirage. Richie hit to games that night and came home $3,000 richer. He spread the money out on the table and smiled at it, savoring his first real win in years. Drinking his last beer, Richie basked in a sense of triumph and relief. He had 6 days to make up the rest of the debt, and he didn't foresee any problems. "Not now, Golden Richie," he said to himself, grinning. Damn straight. Pure gold. Feeling invincible, Richie called his workplace and left a message for his manager, detailing exactly why and how he could go screw himself. Then he collapsed onto his sagging cot, drifting into a deep, alcohol-fueled sleep. That night, Richie dreamed of the curio shop. He stood amid the wreckage, frozen in mute horror as a towering shadow drifted through the closed door and into the room. The dark figure paused over Neville's lifeless body before gliding toward the shattered display case. It hovered there, its presence radiating malice. The figure turned to Richie, and his heart stopped. The entity reached into the broken case and withdrew a single card, laying it face up among the shards of glass. Richie's breath caught as he saw the Joker card the prisoner. His blood ran cold as he recognized the Joker's face. It was his own. His eyes had been gouged out, the empty sockets raw and bleeding against his pale skin. "I'm sorry," Richie squealed, hot wetness spreading across his crotch. "I didn't even want them. I swear. I just needed money." And the dark figure raised its arm, revealing what it held. "A letter opener. Here, I come for your eyes," the shadow whispered. Richie woke up screaming, drenched in sweat, his breath coming in ragged gasps. As he sat in the dark, trying to calm himself, a chilling realization struck him. The old man had somehow known his name Richie Gold even though Richie had never introduced himself. That fact sent a fresh wave of fear crawling down his spine. The rest of the week passed in a haze of frantic activity. Richie roamed from card game to card game, mopping up the competition with his new deck. He was unstoppable. Word quickly spread about Golden Richie and his inexplicable winning streak. By midweek, Richie had to rent a car to expand his search for bigger games with higher stakes. When his 7-day grace period ended, Richie had amassed an astonishing $56,000 and was banned from every card table in the county. It didn't matter. As soon as Richie squared up with Big Jerry Canella, he planned to take his show on the road, blazing a trail across the country. He envisioned a future filled with mansions, luxury cars, and a Rolex for every day of the week. Richie arrived at Canella's pawn shop promptly at noon, alone. He was dressed to impress in a 3/4 length leather jacket, Gucci sunglasses, and polished Paul Stewart derby shoes. Jerry greeted him with a wide, insincere grin and a heavy clap on the shoulder. "Well, if it ain't Golden Richie," Jerry chuckled. "Look at you, dressed to kill. But what happened to your forehead, huh? Did someone get a little upset when you cleaned them out?" "It's a shaving cut," Richie quipped, brushing Jerry's hand off his shoulder with a smug grin. "How you been, big guy, miss me?" Jerry ignored Richie's insolence and ushered him into the back room, where the poker table was folded against the wall and the plastic chairs were stacked neatly. He crowded close, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial murmur. "I heard you've been on quite the streak. Guess your bad luck had to turn around sometime, huh?" Richie pulled an envelope from his jacket and dropped it into Jerry's hands. "Yeah, I've been doing okay. Next time you set up a game, let me know. I'll drop in and show you boys how to play some poker." Jerry's grin faltered, his expression hardening. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. "I don't know what your new hustle is, and I don't care. But if you try that around here, I'll bust your head wide open." "I don't think you would," Richie replied coolly, locking eyes with Jerry. For a brief moment, Jerry hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. Richie's transformation over the past week was undeniable. The look in his eyes was cold and predatory, something Jerry recognized from years of dealing with dangerous people. Richie Gold was no longer a hapless gambler. He had killed to get what he wanted, and he would kill again without hesitation. "Give me some room, fat man," Richie snapped, shoving Jerry aside. Jerry stumbled back, his face flushing red with humiliation and rage. "Get the hell out of here, creep," he spat, "and don't ever let me see your face again." Richie sighed theatrically, feigning disappointment. "That's a shame," he said. "I was looking forward to cleaning you out." "Oh well, plenty of suckers elsewhere. Take care, Jerry." He sauntered out of the shop with a spring in his step, the deck of cards safely tucked in his jacket pocket. Richie was no longer a loser. He was a winner, now and forever. Life was finally going his way. Feeling celebratory, Richie decided a couple of beers would hit the spot. He strolled along 3rd Avenue, window shopping and humming to himself. Eventually, he chose a quiet, clean bar and settled in at the counter. "Give me your fanciest imported beer," Richie told the bartender with a grin. "I'm trying to learn how to appreciate the finer things in life. I'm a gentleman now." The bartender gave him a tired, unimpressed look but nodded. "Sure thing, boss." Coming right up, Richie sipped his beer, relishing the quiet. The bar was empty except for him and the bartender, which was just fine by Richie. Other people, in his eyes, were either walking dollar signs or irrelevant. If he wasn't busy taking their money, he didn't need them around. To Golden Richie, he toasted, raising his glass. To 1,000 victories and 1,000 more. He took a long swallow of the overpriced lager, savoring the taste of triumph. "You seem like you're in a pretty good mood," the bartender remarked from the other end of the bar. "You win some money or something. Those threads you're wearing look brand new," the bartender remarked. "They are, and I did," Richie whooped, pounding his fist on the bar with glee. "I've been at the bottom for so long, but now I'm on top. I'm a winner, you know what I'm saying." "Not really," the bartender grunted. "To be honest, I don't get many winners rolling through here at noon. Richie paused, unsure if the bartender was mocking him. Being the butt of someone else's joke was supposed to be a thing of the past. A hot flare of anger rose in his chest, but he quickly drowned it with another swig of beer. Screw it, who cared what some bartender thought? Richie was finally golden, and nothing could change that. "Mind if I smoke in here?" Richie asked. The bartender shrugged. "Not supposed to, but whatever." He slid a pack of matches down the bar, and Richie lit his cigarette with immense satisfaction. Perhaps he'd start smoking fine cigars, why not? He'd look good with a cigar. He'd look. Richie's eyes wandered to the matchbook in his hand, and the words on the front froze his brain mid-thought. The matches slipped from his fingers and fluttered to the floor. His stomach churned as he gripped the bar to keep from sliding off his stool. The matchbook read, "Welcome to Uncharted Waters." Proprietor, Neville Rawlings. A chill ran down Richie's spine. He'd seen this matchbook before. "Welcome back, Mr. Gold," the bartender croaked. Richie looked up, and his breath caught in his throat. The bartender was no longer an ordinary man. He was Neville Rawlings, his aquiline features mottled with decay. His once white dress shirt was now a crusty, blood-stained brown, and his skeletal grin sent shivers through Richie's entire body. Neville plucked a familiar letter opener from the bar and grinned. "You were looking to join a card game, I believe," he rasped. "I happen to know someone who's also been searching for a game, Mr. Gold. Would you like to meet him?" Richie made a strangled sound, terror gripping him as hot piss soaked his pants. He suddenly realized that he wasn't in a bar at all. He was sitting at the counter of Neville's curio shop, the same blood-spattered mess he'd left behind after his failed robbery. The shop was cloaked in shadow, and the air reeked of rot and decay. Richie bolted for the door, but ran straight into something large and immovable. He let out a tiny shriek and staggered back, his mind a whirlwind of panic. The shadow coalesced into an imposing figure, a man in a long black cloak with a silver skull adorning his hatband. He was tall and powerfully built, his presence radiating menace. A cruel sneer twisted his lips beneath a heavy mustache, and his eyes burned like embers of hellfire. "Good day to you, sir," the man drawled lazily in a southern accent. "My name is Travis Tanner, and I believe you took something that doesn't belong to you. I'm here to take it back. I don't have them with me." Richie squeaked, "I'd have to go get them." Travis raised an eyebrow and slowly shook his head. "You can't bluff Travis Tanner, son. Not at the table, not anywhere. They're in your pocket. Hand them over." Lickety-split. Richie's hand trembled as he fished out the deck of cards. Tanner plucked the deck from Richie's grasp with a faint grimace of distaste and tucked it into his cloak. "You're a pissant," Tanner growled. "A lowlife, bottom-feeding pissant. That's what you are. This is a nightmare," Richie sobbed. "This isn't real. You killed my faithful servant," Tanner said, his voice tinged with wonder. "You should have died right then and there. That was the last bit of real luck you ever had, my friend. Because the moment you laid your dirty hands on those cards, it was over." Neville's decaying corpse shambled forward, letter opener in hand. Richie fell to his knees, his hands raised in supplication. "Aren't we supposed to play for it?" he shrieked. "Come on. Let me play for it. Just one lousy hand." "You already did," Tanner said coldly. "You lost." Richie looked down at his hands and saw 5 cards splayed out. To pair black aces and eights, a dead man's hand. The kicker was the Joker card, depicting the dancing prisoner from Richie's nightmare. The Joker's face was his own, its eyes torn out, the raw, bleeding sockets stuck against pale skin. Tanner revealed his hand, a royal flush. The face cards in Tanner's hand were all pointing at Richie, their laughter echoing in his ears. "Please," Richie whispered. "Please don't do this. Winner takes all." Tanner grinned. Neville surged forward, and Richie screamed. Tanner stood in the background, shuffling his deck with fluid ease as if he were waiting for the show to begin. Neville raised the letter opener, and Richie saw the glint of the blade in the dim light before everything went black. "Thank you for joining me tonight, and I hope to see you back here next week. Until then, listeners, stay spooky. If it's darkness you're after, listener, your search is over. But let it be known, you haven't found the darkness has found you." The babysitter's call. It was supposed to be an easy job. I'd babysat for the Harris family a few times before, and it was always the same routine. Put the kids to bed by 8 p.m., watch some TV, and wait for the parents to come home. Their house was in a quiet neighborhood, the kind where nothing ever seemed to happen. That night started like any other. Mr. and Mrs. Harris were heading to a dinner party, and they left me with their 2 kids, Emma and Tyler. Both were sweet, well-behaved kids who rarely gave me trouble. After dinner, we played a board game. Then I tucked them into bed, reading them their favorite story before turning out the lights. By 8:30 p.m., the house was silent. I grabbed a soda from the fridge and settled onto the couch in the living room. The house felt big and empty now that the kids were asleep, but I didn't mind. I was used to the quiet, and the soft hum of the refrigerator and occasional creak of the house settling were oddly comforting. I was scrolling through my phone when the landline rang. The sudden noise made me jump. The Harrises had never mentioned they still used their landline, and I hadn't heard it ring during any of my previous babysitting jobs. I hesitated before answering. "Hello?" There was silence on the other end. For a moment, I thought it might be a prank call, but then I heard something faint as soft, raspy breathing. "Hello," I said again, louder this time. The line went dead. I hung up, my heart racing. It was probably just a wrong number, I told myself, nothing to worry about. I went back to scrolling through my phone, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling settling in my chest. About 10 minutes later, the phone rang again. This time, I grabbed it on the first ring. "Hello." There was no response at first, just that same heavy breathing. Then a voice low and distorted spoke. "Did you check on the children?" A chill ran down my spine. "Who is this?" I demanded. The line went dead again. I stood there, staring at the phone in my hand. My first instinct was to call the Harrises, but I didn't want to bother them if it was just someone messing around. Instead, I decided to check on the kids. I crept up the stairs, my footsteps soft on the carpeted steps. The hallway was dark, lit only by the faint glow of a nightlight plugged into the wall. I pushed open Emma's door first. She was fast asleep, her small body curled up under the covers. I moved to Tyler's room next. He was snoring softly, clutching his favorite stuffed animal. Both kids were fine. Relieved, I headed back downstairs, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. It was probably just a coincidence, I thought. Someone had called the wrong number and said something creepy as a joke, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. I sat back down on the couch, keeping the phone close by. The minutes ticked by slowly, and the house seemed quieter than ever. Then the phone rang again. This time, I didn't hesitate. "Who is this?" I snapped. The same distorted voice spoke, calm and deliberate. "You should check on the children." My blood ran cold. "If this is a joke, it's not funny," I said, my voice shaking. "Leave me alone." The line went dead again. I grabbed my phone and called Mr. Harris's number. He answered after a few rings, his voice cheerful. "Everything okay?" "Someone keeps calling the house," I said quickly. "They're asking about the kids. It's really creepy." There was a pause. "What do you mean, asking about the kids?" "They keep saying I should check on them," I explained, glancing nervously at the stairs. Mr. Harris's tone shifted, suddenly serious. "Call the police," he said. "We're on our way home right now." I hung up and immediately dialed 911. The dispatcher was calm and professional, assuring me an officer would be there soon. I waited by the front door, clutching my phone tightly. Every creak and shadow in the house felt sinister, and I kept glancing at the stairs, half expecting to see someone standing at the top. The police arrived within minutes. 2 officers came inside and began searching the house while I stayed in the living room, my heart pounding. When they came back downstairs, their faces were grim. "We found the back door unlocked," one of them said. "It looks like someone was inside." My stomach dropped. "The kids," I whispered. "They're fine," the officer assured me. "But we need to know if anything was moved or taken." I shook my head. "I don't think so. Everything looks the same." The Harrises arrived shortly after, their faces pale with worry. The police explained what had happened, and Mr. Harris immediately checked on the kids, who were still fast asleep. The officers stayed for a while, taking statements and looking for fingerprints. They didn't find much, just a few smudges on the back door that could have been anyone's. By the time they left, it was nearly midnight. The Harrises insisted on driving me home, apologizing profusely for what had happened. I didn't sleep that night. For weeks, I couldn't shake the memory of that voice on the phone. I kept wondering who it was, how they knew the house, and what they wanted. The Harrises never asked me to babysit again, and honestly, I was relieved. Even now, years later, I still get chills every time I hear a landline ring. The house at the end of the street, every neighborhood has that house. The one that seems darker than the others, where the windows are always shuttered and the yard is overgrown and neglected. In my neighborhood, the house was at the very end of the street, standing like a sentinel at the edge of the cul-de-sac. Growing up, it was the house we all whispered about. We'd dare each other to knock on the door, but no one ever did. There were rumors, of course, stories passed down from older kids about strange noises, mysterious lights, and a recluse who never left the house. For years, the house stayed quiet, seemingly empty. Then one day, when I was about 12, we noticed a change. It started with small things. The curtains, which had been drawn for as long as anyone could remember, were suddenly open. A car, dusty and old, appeared in the driveway. At night, a single light would glow in one of the upstairs windows. The neighborhood buzzed with speculation. Maybe someone finally moved in, my mom said at dinner one evening. But who would want to live there? My dad replied, shaking his head. I was fascinated. The house had always been a source of mystery and fear, and now it was alive again. My friends and I started making excuses to walk past it, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever lived there. We rarely saw anyone. Occasionally, we'd spot a figure, a man, thin and stooped, moving through the shadows inside. Once, I saw him step outside to retrieve the mail. He wore a long coat, even though it was the middle of summer, and he moved quickly, almost furtively, back into the house. Then the noises started. At first, it was just late at night. I'd be lying in bed, the windows open to let in the summer breeze, when I'd hear a faint, rhythmic tapping sound. I thought it was tree branches brushing against something, but when I mentioned it to my friends, they said they'd heard it too. "It's coming from that house," my friend Danny said one afternoon. "I swear I heard it when I was walking my dog last night." "What do you think it is?" I asked. He shrugged, but his face was pale. "I don't know. But it's creepy." Curiosity got the better of us. One evening, just before sunset, Danny and I decided to check it out. We waited until the street was empty, then crept down the sidewalk toward the house. The yard was worse up close. The grass was knee-high, and the bushes along the front porch were wild and overgrown. The house itself looked like it was crumbling, paint peeling from the walls, shingles missing from the roof. We stopped at the edge of the driveway, peering at the dark windows. The tapping sound started again, faint but steady, like someone drumming their fingers on a table. "Do you hear that?" Danny whispered. I nodded, my heart pounding. "Let's get closer," he said. I didn't want to, but I didn't want to look scared either. We crept onto the lawn, the dry grass crunching softly under our feet. The tapping grew louder. We reached the base of the porch steps and froze. The sound was definitely coming from inside. Danny glanced at me, his face pale. "What do you think it is?" "I don't know," I whispered. Suddenly, the tapping stopped. The silence was deafening. We stood there, holding our breath, too scared to move. Then, from somewhere deep inside the house, we heard a low, guttural noise, a sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "Let's go," I hissed, grabbing Danny's arm. We bolted, racing back down the street without looking back. That night, I lay awake in bed, the memory of that noise replaying in my head. What could have made a sound like that? A few days later, I noticed something new. The man's car, which had always been parked in the driveway, was gone. The house looked darker than usual, its windows like black holes. "Maybe he moved out," my mom said when I mentioned it at breakfast. "Good riddance," my dad muttered. But something about it didn't feel right. The house wasn't just empty, it felt abandoned, like no one had been there for a long time. A week later, Danny and I decided to check it out one last time. It was broad daylight, and the street was quiet. We told ourselves it would be fine. The front door was locked, but one of the side windows was open. Danny boosted me up, and I climbed through, landing in what looked like a living room. The air inside was stale, heavy with the smell of dust and mildew. The furniture was old and mismatched, and the walls were lined with shelves full of books and knickknacks. "Do you see anything?" Danny whispered from outside. "Just dot stuff," I said. I moved further into the house, my footsteps creaking on the wooden floor. There was a faint sound coming from upstairs, a soft, rhythmic tapping. My heart raced as I climbed the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. The tapping grew louder, coming from one of the bedrooms at the end of the hall. I reached the door and pushed it open. The room was empty. The tapping was coming from the window, where a branch was scraping against the glass. I let out a shaky laugh, relief flooding through me. But then I noticed something else. On the wall opposite the window, written in large, jagged letters, was a single word: "Leave." I didn't wait to see anything else. I bolted back down the stairs, out the window, and onto the lawn. "What happened?" Danny asked, his eyes wide. "Let's just go," I said, grabbing his arm. We never went back to that house. A few weeks later, it was boarded up, the windows and doors sealed shut. No one ever moved in again. Even now, I still think about that house. I wonder who lived there, what they were hiding, and why they left so suddenly. And sometimes, late at night, I can still hear that tapping sound. The wrong apartment. I still can't believe how careless I was that night. I was exhausted, distracted, and not paying attention. There's no excuse for what happened. I live in a large apartment complex where all the halls and doors look the same, and it's easy to get turned around, especially late at night. That evening, I'd been out running errands and came home feeling completely drained. I climbed the stairs, thinking I was on my floor, but I wasn't. When I reached what I thought was my apartment, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. It wasn't wide open, just cracked enough to make me hesitate. I assumed I must have forgotten to shut it properly when I left earlier. That happens sometimes, right? Without giving it much thought, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The apartment was dark except for a faint glow coming from the living room, where a muted TV played a news channel. The layout was exactly like mine, living room straight ahead, kitchen to the left, but something felt off. The air smelled different. It wasn't bad, just unfamiliar. Hello? I called out, my voice sounding oddly out of place. There was no response. I figured maybe my roommate had left the TV on and gone to bed. That's when I started to notice the little details. The furniture was arranged differently. There was a coat on the back of the couch I didn't recognize and boots by the door that weren't mine or my roommate's. That's when it hit me. This wasn't my apartment. My stomach sank as embarrassment washed over me. Oh God, I walked into someone else's place. I spun around, ready to leave, but before I could move, I heard the lock click behind me. A man was standing just inside the door. I hadn't even heard him come in. He was tall, in his mid-30s, wearing a heavy jacket as if he'd just come from outside. In one hand, he held a grocery bag, but his eyes weren't on it. They were fixed on me. "What are you doing in here?" he asked, his voice calm, but with a sharp edge that made my skin crawl. "I'm sorry," I stammered. "I think I made a mistake. I thought this was my apartment." I tried to move toward the door, but he didn't step aside. He just stood there, watching me. Then he set the grocery bag down, slow and deliberate, like he had all the time in the world. "You thought this was your apartment," he repeated. His tone hadn't changed, but the way he stared at me made my heart race. "Yes," I said, my voice trembling. "I live upstairs. I must have gotten off on the wrong floor. I'm really sorry." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached behind him and slid the deadbolt into place. The sound made my heart skip a beat. "Then why didn't you leave when you realized it wasn't yours?" he asked. "I was about to," I said quickly, my voice shaking. "I swear, I just realized. Don't lie to me." He cut in, his voice no longer calm. It was sharper, more menacing. He took a step toward me, and I instinctively stepped back, nearly tripping over a coffee table. "I'm not lying," I said, hating how scared I sounded. "It was just a mistake. Please, I'll leave right now." He didn't respond right away. He just stared at me, then nodded slowly, as if making a decision. "Okay," he said, "if it was just a mistake, let's talk about it." "Sit down." "I don't need to sit down," I said, trying to sound firm. "I'll just sit down." It wasn't a suggestion. His tone left no room for argument. Trembling, I sat on the couch, my hands shaking in my lap. He stayed standing, watching me closely. "What's your name?" he asked. I told him, my voice barely audible. "And you live upstairs?" "Yes," I said, "just one floor up." "What's your apartment number?" I hesitated before answering, hoping he'd believe me and let me leave. He nodded slowly, as if filing the information away. "You know," he said, tilting his head, "people don't just walk into the wrong apartment by accident." "It was an accident," I said, my voice shaking. I swear I wasn't paying attention. He studied me for a moment, then leaned in slightly. "Do you know how many break-ins happen in this building?" he asked, his voice low. "Do you know what people like you do when they think no one's home?" "I'm not a thief," I said quickly. "I promise I'm not. You think I don't know what you're doing?" He interrupted, his tone sharp. I didn't know what to say. My throat felt dry, and panic clawed at my chest. I wanted to run, but I didn't dare move. He reached into his pocket, and my stomach dropped. For a moment, I thought he was pulling out a weapon, but instead, he took out his phone. "I should call the cops," he said. Please don't, I begged, my voice breaking. I didn't do anything. I swear it was just a mistake. He stared at me for what felt like forever, then lowered his phone. Get out, he said. I didn't wait. I bolted to the door, my hands shaking so badly I could barely undo the lock. As I stepped into the hallway, I glanced back. He was standing in the doorway, his face unreadable, watching me until I shut the door. I ran up the stairs to my actual apartment and locked myself inside. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, and my heart felt like it was going to burst. I didn't sleep that night. I still don't know what he thought I was doing or why he let me go, but I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. The rest stop nightmare long road trips are something I usually enjoy. There's a freedom in driving for hours, the hum of the engine blending with music or podcasts, and the landscape changing as the miles tick by. This trip was no different, or at least, it wasn't supposed to be. I was driving cross-country to visit a friend. It was late fall, and the days were growing shorter, so I tried to cover as much ground as possible during daylight. But after a series of unexpected delays, traffic, construction, and a detour that added nearly an hour, I found myself still driving well after dark. The highway stretched out before me, a seemingly endless ribbon of asphalt cutting through the wilderness. Tall pine trees lined both sides, their silhouettes black against the night sky. My GPS showed no towns or gas stations for miles, just an occasional rest stop. I'd been on the road for hours and desperately needed a break. When I saw a sign for a rest area ahead, I decided to pull over. It wasn't ideal, but I needed to stretch my legs and clear my head before continuing. The rest stop appeared out of the darkness like a ghost, its dim lights casting eerie shadows across the empty lot. There were only a few cars parked there, all of them dark and silent. A single vending machine stood near the entrance, its light flickering weakly. I parked near the far edge of the lot, away from the other cars, and stepped out of my vehicle. The air was cold and still, carrying the faint smell of damp leaves. I glanced around, my footsteps echoing on the pavement as I made my way to the vending machine. I fumbled for change and punched in the code for a bottle of water. As the bottle dropped into the slot, I heard a noise, a faint shuffling sound, like someone walking across the lot. I froze, my eyes darting toward the source of the sound. At first, I didn't see anything. The lot was empty, the other cars dark and motionless. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of movement. A figure emerged from the shadows near the far side of the rest area. They were tall and thin, their face obscured by a hood. They moved slowly, deliberately, heading in my direction. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just another traveler stretching their legs, like me. But something about the way they moved set me on edge. I grabbed my water and hurried back to my car, locking the doors as soon as I got inside. The figure kept walking, their pace unchanging, until they reached the middle of the lot. Then they stopped. They were facing my car. I felt my chest tighten as I stared at them, their features hidden in the darkness. They didn't move, didn't wave or gesture, just stood there, as if waiting for something. My hand hovered over the ignition, but I didn't start the car. Part of me didn't want to draw attention to myself. I turned off the interior light, my breath shallow as I tried to stay calm. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The figure didn't move. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I turned the key in the ignition, the engine roaring to life. The sound seemed deafening in the stillness. That's when they moved. The figure began walking toward my car, their movements faster now, more purposeful. Panic surged through me as I threw the car into reverse, my tires screeching against the pavement. I backed out of the parking spot and sped toward the exit, my eyes flicking between the rearview mirror and the road ahead. The figure broke into a run. I pressed the gas pedal harder, my heart pounding as I reached the highway. I didn't look back again until I was several miles down the road. The rest stop was long behind me, and the only lights on the horizon were the faint glow of an approaching town. I pulled into a well-lit gas station and parked near the entrance, my hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. I stayed there for a long time, my heart racing as I replayed what had happened in my head. Who was that person? What did they want? I never found out. To this day, I avoid rest stops at night. Even now, whenever I see one, I think about that figure in the lot, standing motionless, watching me from the shadows. The wrong apartment. I still can't believe how careless I was that night. I was exhausted, distracted, and not paying attention. There's no excuse for what happened. I live in a large apartment complex where all the halls and doors look the same, and it's easy to get turned around, especially late at night. That evening, I'd been out running errands and came home feeling completely drained. I climbed the stairs, thinking I was on my floor, but I wasn't. When I reached what I thought was my apartment, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. It wasn't wide open, just cracked enough to make me hesitate. I assumed I must have forgotten to shut it properly when I left earlier. That happens sometimes, right? Without giving it much thought, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The apartment was dark except for a faint glow coming from the living room, where a muted TV played a news channel. The layout was exactly like mine: living room straight ahead, kitchen to the left, but something felt off. The air smelled different. It wasn't bad, just unfamiliar. Hello? I called out, my voice sounding oddly out of place. There was no response. I figured maybe my roommate had left the TV on and gone to bed. That's when I started to notice the little details. The furniture was arranged differently. There was a coat on the back of the couch I didn't recognize, and boots by the door that weren't mine or my roommate's. That's when it hit me. This wasn't my apartment. My stomach sank as embarrassment washed over me. Oh God, I walked into someone else's place. I spun around, ready to leave, but before I could move, I heard the lock click behind me. A man was standing just inside the door. I hadn't even heard him come in. He was tall, in his mid-30s, wearing a heavy jacket as if he'd just come from outside. In one hand, he held a grocery bag, but his eyes weren't on it. They were fixed on me. "What are you doing in here?" he asked, his voice calm but with a sharp edge that made my skin crawl. "I'm sorry," I stammered. "I think I made a mistake. I thought this was my apartment." I tried to move toward the door, but he didn't step aside. He just stood there, watching me. Then he set the grocery bag down, slow and deliberate, like he had all the time in the world. "You thought this was your apartment," he repeated. His tone hadn't changed, but the way he stared at me made my heart race. "Yes," I said, my voice trembling. "I live upstairs. I must have gotten off on the wrong floor. I'm really sorry." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached behind him and slid the deadbolt into place. The sound made my heart skip a beat. "Then why didn't you leave when you realized it wasn't yours?" he asked. "I was about to," I said quickly, my voice shaking. "I swear, I just realized. Don't lie to me." He cut in, his voice no longer calm. It was sharper, more menacing. He took a step toward me, and I instinctively stepped back, nearly tripping over a coffee table. "I'm not lying," I said, hating how scared I sounded. "It was just a mistake. Please, I'll leave right now." He didn't respond right away. He just stared at me, then nodded slowly, as if making a decision. "Okay," he said, "if it was just a mistake, let's talk about it." "Sit down." "I don't need to sit down," I said, trying to sound firm. "I'll just sit down." It wasn't a suggestion. His tone left no room for argument. Trembling, I sat on the couch, my hands shaking in my lap. He stayed standing, watching me closely. "What's your name?" he asked. I told him, my voice barely audible. "And you live upstairs?" "Yes," I said. "Just one floor up." "What's your apartment number?" I hesitated before answering, hoping he'd believe me and let me leave. He nodded slowly, as if filing the information away. "You know," he said, tilting his head, "people don't just walk into the wrong apartment by accident." "It was an accident," I said, my voice shaking. I swear I wasn't paying attention. He studied me for a moment, then leaned in slightly. "Do you know how many break-ins happen in this building?" he asked, his voice low. "Do you know what people like you do when they think no one's home?" "I'm not a thief," I said quickly. "I promise I'm not. You think I don't know what you're doing?" He interrupted, his tone sharp. I didn't know what to say. My throat felt dry, and panic clawed at my chest. I wanted to run, but I didn't dare move. He reached into his pocket, and my stomach dropped. For a moment, I thought he was pulling out a weapon, but instead, he took out his phone. "I should call the cops," he said. "Please don't," I begged, my voice breaking. "I didn't do anything. I swear it was just a mistake." He stared at me for what felt like forever, then lowered his phone. "Get out," he said. I didn't wait. I bolted to the door, my hands shaking so badly I could barely undo the lock. As I stepped into the hallway, I glanced back. He was standing in the doorway, his face unreadable, watching me until I shut the door. I ran up the stairs to my actual apartment and locked myself inside. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, and my heart felt like it was going to burst. I didn't sleep that night. I still don't know what he thought I was doing or why he let me go, but I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. The highway stalker, it happened on a stretch of highway I've driven more times than I can count. The road is long and quiet, bordered by woods on both sides, and at night, it feels endless. That night, I was driving home from visiting my sister. It was late, maybe a little after 11 p.m., and the road was empty. I don't mind driving alone at night. It's peaceful, and there's something calming about the sound of the tires on the pavement. But this time felt different. As I drove, I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. They were far back at first, just a pair of small lights in the distance. I didn't think much of it at first. Cars come and go, even on a quiet road like this. But as I continued driving, the headlights stayed in my mirror. They weren't gaining on me, but they weren't falling back either. It was as if they were matching my speed exactly. I told myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe the driver was going the same way I was. Still, the longer it went on, the more uneasy I felt. The car wasn't passing me, even when the road opened up with no oncoming traffic. It just stayed behind me, a constant presence in the dark. After about 20 minutes, I started to get nervous. My grip on the steering wheel tightened as I glanced at the mirror more frequently. I considered slowing down to let them pass, but something in my gut told me not to. Instead, I sped up, hoping to put some distance between us. For a moment, it worked. The headlights grew smaller in my mirror, and I let out a shaky breath. But then, I saw them again closer this time. The car had sped up too. Now, I was scared. My mind raced with possibilities. Was the driver following me, or was I just being paranoid? Either way, I didn't want to take any chances. I scanned the road ahead, looking for an exit or a gas station anywhere with people. But this part of the highway was deserted, nothing but trees and the occasional streetlight. Then, the car behind me did something that made my blood run cold. It flashed its high beams once, then again. The sudden bursts of light filled my car, and I felt my heart pound. What did they want? I kept driving, trying to stay calm, but my hands were shaking. The car behind me got closer, almost tailgating now. The high beams flashed again, and this time, they stayed on, blinding me through my mirrors. I panicked. I floored the gas pedal, pushing my car to go faster. The engine roared as I sped down the highway, but the other car kept up, its headlights glaring in my mirror. Up ahead, I spotted a rest area sign. Relief washed over me. I'd pull in, find other people, and figure out what to do. As I approached, I signaled and veered off the highway, pulling into the parking lot. The car behind me didn't follow. I parked under a bright light and sat there for a moment, trying to catch my breath. My hands were still gripping the steering wheel, and my heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. After a few minutes, I dared to look back at the highway. The car was gone. I didn't know where it went or why it had been following me, but I wasn't about to wait around to find out. I stayed in the rest area for a while, watching as other cars came and went. Eventually, I felt calm enough to get back on the road. The rest of the drive home was uneventful, but the feeling of being watched never quite left me. Even now, I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't pulled off the highway. The elevator incident. It was a long day at the office, one of those days where everything seemed to take twice as long as it should. Deadlines piled up, meetings dragged on, and by the time I finished, it was already past 11 p.m. The office building was nearly empty, the usual hum of voices and ringing phones replaced by an eerie quiet. I gathered my things, shut down my computer, and turned off the desk lamp. As I walked through the empty office, the sound of my footsteps echoed in the open space. It felt strange being there alone, but I shrugged it off. Late nights like this weren't unusual, and I was too tired to dwell on it. The hallway outside my office was dimly lit, the fluorescent lights casting a cold glow on the tiled floor. I pressed the button for the elevator and waited, glancing down at my phone to check the time. 11:23 p.m. I had missed the last train home, which meant a pricey cab ride was in my future. The elevator arrived with a soft ding, the doors sliding open to reveal an empty car. I stepped inside and hit the button for the lobby. The doors closed, and the car began its descent, the gentle hum of machinery the only sound. I leaned against the wall, scrolling absent-mindedly through my phone. The glow of the screen was comforting, a small bubble of light in the otherwise sterile elevator. Then the elevator jolted. It wasn't violent, but enough to make me stumble. The car slowed, then stopped altogether. The digital display above the doors showed I was on the 23rd floor. Great, I muttered, pressing the lobby button again. Nothing happened. I sighed and pressed the emergency button. A moment later, a crackling voice came through the speaker. "Building maintenance. What's the issue?" "The elevator stopped," I said. "I'm stuck on the 23rd floor." "All right," the voice replied. "We'll send someone up to check it out. Sit tight." I thanked them and ended the call, leaning back against the wall. I'd been stuck in an elevator once before, years ago, and it had been resolved quickly. This time would probably be the same, but then the lights flickered. It was brief, just a momentary dimming, but it sent a chill down my spine. The faint hum of the elevator's machinery was gone now, leaving only silence. I checked my phone. No signal. The elevator jolted again. This time, it felt deliberate, as if something or someone had caused it. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing in the confined space. There was no answer. I pressed the emergency button again, but this time, there was only static. The buttons on the panel didn't light up, no matter how many times I pressed them. I glanced around the car, my chest tightening. The walls of the elevator seemed closer than before, the air heavier, and then I heard it, a faint tapping sound, coming from somewhere above me. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, like someone knocking on the roof of the elevator. "Is someone there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The tapping stopped. For a few moments, there was only silence. Then the elevator jolted again, harder this time, sending me stumbling forward. The lights flickered once more, and when they stabilized, I saw it a shadow, faint but unmistakable, cast against the back wall of the elevator. It was shaped like a person, but distorted, the edges blurring as if it were moving slightly. I spun around, but the car was empty. The shadow remained. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The shadow didn't respond. Instead, it began to move, sliding across the wall toward me. I pressed myself into the corner, my breaths coming in short gasps. My hand fumbled for my phone, but it was useless. No signal, no light, nothing. The shadow reached the edge of the wall and stopped. For a moment, it was perfectly still. Then, slowly, it began to rise, stretching upward until it disappeared into the ceiling. The tapping resumed, louder this time, coming from all sides. I covered my ears, my heart racing. The sound grew louder and faster, a chaotic rhythm that filled the tiny space. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The elevator jolted one final time and began to move. The lights brightened, the hum of machinery returning as the car descended toward the lobby. I stared at the doors, my hands shaking, willing them to open. When the elevator finally stopped and the doors slid open, I stumbled out, gasping for air. The lobby was empty, the security desk unstaffed. The silence felt heavier than ever, pressing in on me from all sides. I didn't wait to figure out why. I bolted through the glass doors and into the night, not stopping until I reached my car. For days, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I debated telling someone, my boss, the building manager, anyone, but what would I say? That I saw a shadow, that something was tapping on the elevator walls? Eventually, I convinced myself it was just a bad dream or a trick of my overworked mind. But even now, years later, I can't set foot in an elevator without feeling a surge of panic, because whatever was in that elevator with me that night, I don't think it was ever human. The dorm encounter, it was a typical Friday night, and the dorm was unusually quiet. Most of my friends had gone home or out for the weekend, leaving the halls eerily still. I had decided to stay in, partly to catch up on some overdue assignments, and partly because I wasn't in the mood for loud music, crowded parties, or bar hopping. By 11 p.m., I had finished most of my work and was curled up in bed, aimlessly scrolling through social media on my phone. The quiet was almost comforting, the kind of rare stillness you don't usually find in a dorm. The only sounds were the occasional creaks of the old building settling and the faint hum of the heating system. I welcomed the calm, letting it lull me into a state of relaxation. Then came the first knock. It wasn't loud, just a soft but deliberate rapping at my door. The sound startled me, breaking the peaceful silence so abruptly that my heart skipped a beat. I wasn't expecting anyone. My roommate had left hours ago, saying she wouldn't be back until Sunday. I couldn't think of a single person who would be visiting me this late. Cautiously, I slid out of bed and tiptoed toward the door. My bare feet felt cold against the linoleum floor, adding to the chill that was slowly creeping up my spine. "Who is it?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. There was no reply. I hesitated for a moment, then leaned forward to peer through the peephole. The hallway outside was dimly lit, the fluorescent bulbs flickering faintly. It was empty. My pulse quickened. Maybe it was just a prank, I thought. People in dorms do this sort of thing all the time, knock and run, just for laughs. I shook my head, half amused at my own nervousness, and went back to bed, determined not to let it bother me. Minutes passed, and I was beginning to forget about it when the knocking came again. This time, it was louder and more urgent, 3 sharp raps that seemed to echo through the quiet room. I froze, my body tensing. Slowly, I got up and crept back to the door, my heart pounding. Once again, I looked through the peephole, but the hallway was still empty. My stomach twisted with unease. "Who's there?" I called out, louder this time. No answer. Something about this felt wrong, deeply wrong. I debated opening the door to check, but my instincts told me not to. Instead, I turned the deadbolt, ensuring the door was locked, and stepped away. I tried to convince myself it was just someone being annoying, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. I got back into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin as if they could somehow shield me. My phone buzzed, a welcome distraction, and I grabbed it to check my roommate's Instagram story. But before I could focus on it, there was another sound, of faint, scraping noise. It was coming from the door. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a knock this time. It sounded like someone was dragging something sharp, maybe fingernails or a tool, across the wood. Slowly, methodically, I stared at the door, too afraid to move. The noise was deliberate, almost calculated, like whoever was out there wanted me to know they weren't in a hurry. My mind raced with possibilities. Was this some kind of cruel joke? Or was someone trying to break in? Finally, I grabbed my phone, my hands trembling as I unlocked it and dialed campus security. My voice was shaking as I explained what was happening. They assured me someone would be there in a few minutes. The waiting was agony. Every second felt like an eternity as I sat frozen on the edge of my bed, listening to the steady scrape against the door. I thought about calling someone else, a friend, my parents, but I didn't want to take my eyes off the door. Finally, after what felt like hours, I heard footsteps in the hallway and a firm knock. "Campus security," a voice called out. Relief washed over me, and I bolted to the door, unlocking it as fast as my trembling hands would allow. When I opened the door, a campus officer stood there with a flashlight in hand, but the hallway was empty. Whoever had been outside my door was gone. The officer looked around, checking the hallway and nearby stairwell, but found nothing. There were no marks on the door, no signs of forced entry, nothing to prove what had happened. He told me it was likely a prank and that I shouldn't worry, but his reassurances did little to calm me. I locked the door as soon as he left and crawled back into bed, pulling the covers tight around me. I didn't sleep that night. Every small sound made me jump, and I kept replaying the knocking and scraping in my head. To this day, I still don't know who was outside my door or what they wanted. Was it just a prank or something more sinister? The thought still haunts me. And now, I present to you The Taking. For what felt like the 100th time or more, Liz found herself staring at her unfinished geometry homework. The name Liz was scrawled neatly at the top of the page, next to the words 7th grade geometry. A faint film of dust blurred the edges of the writing, a quiet testament to how long the task had been neglected. She sat in her favorite chair by the dining table, the one with the perfect view of the garden through the back window. Out there, her mother was busy pulling weeds and carefully tending to her rows of candy cane radishes, Liz's favorite. Her mother paused briefly, brushing dirt off her hands before glancing at the baby monitor clipped to her belt. A soft smile appeared on her face, likely spurred by the soothing murmur of baby Sarah's slumber. That smile warmed Liz's heart. It had been so long since she'd seen her mother genuinely at peace. Then the front door clicked open. Liz froze. She couldn't see the door from where she was sitting, but out of habit, she thought, "Daddy's home." However, her father wasn't due back from work yet. Moments later, heavy footsteps pounded across the living room carpet. Each step was deliberate, slow, and almost menacing. Liz's chest tightened. These weren't her father's footsteps. Stomp, stomp, stomp. The heavy sound transitioned from the muffled thud of carpet to the sharp, hollow creak of the wooden staircase. The intruder was ascending, their steps dragging as if they carried immense weight. Liz glanced outside. Her mother was still absorbed in her gardening, oblivious to the growing threat inside. Then it hit her, the baby. Sarah was sleeping upstairs in the nursery. Panic surged through Liz as she leapt from her chair. Rounding the corner into the living room, she found it empty, but the ominous footsteps were already halfway up the stairs. Liz followed, moving faster than she thought possible, her heart racing. Yet no matter how quickly she climbed, the footsteps remained just ahead, unseen in the dim hallway light. The nursery door creaked open. Liz's heart sank as the familiar melody of "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star" spilled into the hallway. Peering cautiously around the doorframe, she saw no one, only baby Sarah sleeping soundly in her crib. Then, as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps reversed, stomping back down the stairs. They exited through the front door with a final echoing click. Relief washed over Liz, but it was fleeting. She turned back to the crib to check on Sarah, who remained unharmed but restless in her sleep. Before long, Liz heard her mother's cheerful voice floating up from downstairs, calling out, "Sounds like someone needs a hug." Liz smiled faintly. Hugs, how she wished those words were meant for her. That night at dinner, Liz witnessed something she hadn't seen in months, her parents laughing together. Baby Sarah, sitting in her high chair, was gleefully smashing mushy radishes with her tiny spoon, splattering them across the table. Her father laughed heartily as a chunk of radish hit her mother square on the cheek. Even her mother couldn't suppress a giggle as she playfully swatted his arm. Encouraged by the fun, Sarah dropped her spoon entirely, sending a fresh spray of radish puree flying. One particularly large glob landed squarely on Liz's abandoned homework. The room fell silent. Her father cleared his throat, dabbing at the mess with a napkin, while her mother looked away, her expression a mix of guilt and sorrow. "Maybe it's time we put those away," her mother muttered, almost too quietly to be heard. Liz felt an ache deep in her chest. "They're forgetting about me already," she thought, as sadness welled up. It had been 6 months since the accident, 6 months since Liz had died. She wanted so badly to be a part of their laughter again, to sit at the table and share in the joy. But instead, she sat in silence, watching from the sidelines of a life she could no longer join. Her father broke the tension with a quiet suggestion. "Let's talk about it later." "I think we're disturbing Sarah." "Yes," her mother agreed softly. "She's very sensitive," Liz sighed, placing her hand protectively over her dusty homework. Homework she once despised had become her last connection to the world she'd left behind. But her thoughts were interrupted when she heard it again, the sound of the front door creaking open, followed by heavy, deliberate footsteps. Stomp, stomp, stomp. Liz glances at her parents, expecting some reaction that might help her make sense of what's happening. Yet, they remained focused on cleaning up Sarah, oblivious to the growing tension. The footsteps grow louder, no longer heading for the stairs, but instead moving closer. Still, her parents don't react. Stomp, stomp. The sound enters the dining room and halts just at the head of the table. If there had been a figure attached to those ominous steps, it would now be standing directly behind Sarah's high chair, close enough to touch. And yet, her parents remain unaware. Liz feels the same wave of warmth from before, but it's no longer gentle. It's stronger now, almost oppressive, and carries with it a foul stench. Sarah, as sensitive as their mother had described, begins to squirm, trying to look behind her. A split second later, she erupts into a piercing, banshee-like wail that jolts everyone. Liz's father lifts Sarah from the high chair, holding and bouncing her in a comforting rhythm. This seems to calm the baby slightly, but as they pass through the spot where the unseen figure had been standing, the oppressive warmth flares up for a moment before the footsteps resume their path, retreating out the front door. Liz watches as the door clicks shut, her gaze shifting back to the smudge of dried radish on her homework. Her mother is outside pulling weeds. Her father is at work. Sarah is asleep. The streak of mashed radish remains, a small blemish on the dusty papers that Liz finds herself powerless to erase. She's tried to preserve this tangible piece of her memory, but the effort of interacting with the world has grown increasingly exhausting. Each attempt leaves her weaker. Still, last night's events linger heavily in her thoughts. This isn't about radishes anymore. It's about the footsteps. Their foreboding nature gnaws at her. Could they belong to another ghost? If so, why hadn't she noticed it before now? And why did it seem drawn to her sister? Her sister, Sarah, it seemed, was somehow aware of the presence. Could she hear it? See it? Could she even see Liz? No, that couldn't be it. Liz had tried to communicate with the living countless times before. It was a draining process, requiring more willpower than she often had. But Sarah was different. Sensitive, their mother had called her. Maybe Sarah could. Suddenly, the air grows warmer, bringing with it a foul, familiar smell. Liz steels herself, knowing what's coming. The front door creaks open, and the footsteps resume heavy, deliberate, and ascending the stairs once more. She wills herself after them, ignoring the barriers of walls and doors, and reaches the nursery just as the footsteps stop. But again, there is no one there. "Who are you?" Liz demands, her voice echoing in the empty room. Silence answers her, and the absence of a response feels more chilling than anything else could. Moments pass, the air pulsing with heat. The sulfuric stench intensifies, triggering memories of what it felt like to have a heartbeat. Stomp, stomp, stomp. The footsteps retreat, descending the stairs and exiting the house. Liz remains near the crib, where Sarah stirs in her sleep, seemingly caught in a bad dream. Liz longs to comfort her, but there's nothing she can do. The front door creaks shut in the distance, followed by an eerie sound like gravel crunching under a car tire. Then, unbidden, a thought invades Liz's mind. Soon, the word is simple but ominous. The door clicks shut, leaving Liz with the terrifying certainty that Sarah is in danger. She doesn't know how, but she knows it's true. That evening, as her parents eat dinner, play with Sarah, and watch TV carrying on with life as if nothing is wrong, Liz can't stop thinking about the nursery and the sulfuric smell. It can only mean one thing: a demon. Even though she had only been 12 when she was alive, Liz knows that smell all too well. The entity's visits have been sporadic so far, never at a set time, but she resolves to be vigilant. It's not like she has anything else to do. That night, Liz hovers near the crib that used to be hers, watching over her infant sister. Her parents had once whispered about the crib being a sign of moving on. Resentment threatens to surface, but Liz pushes it down. She can't afford to dwell on her own injustices. She has a job to do. The hours pass quietly until just before sunrise. Stomp, stomp, stomp. Liz braces herself as the heat surges. The sulfuric smell floods the nursery as the entity enters the room. "Who are you?" Liz demands again, her voice stronger this time. This time, there's a response, a deep, gravelly growl that seems to resonate from nowhere. "Away with you, trifling thing." The voice travels through Liz's mind, blurring the line between sound and thought. For a moment, she wonders whether she actually heard it or merely imagined it. The oppressive push to flee fills her, but she forces herself to resist. "What do you want with my sister?" she quavers, her voice trembling. The gravelly voice seems taken aback, just slightly. Strong will for a human spirit, it growls dismissively. Without another word, the presence retreats the way it came, stomping down the stairs. Its distant muttering drifts back up to her, carrying a single ominous word: tomorrow. A faint sense of satisfaction lingers in its tone. The next day unfolds like any other. Liz's mother picks tomatoes in the garden. Sarah watches her from a shaded bassinet, and the faint sounds of life continue within the house. Liz sits in her usual chair at the dining room table, agitated and restless. Her father will be home soon, and the family will laugh, smile, and carry on as if nothing is amiss. But Liz knows better. She knows she has to act, even if it costs her everything, her energy, her very essence. Maybe, she thinks, it will finally let them forget about her and move on. But as the thought takes hold, she stops herself. A single speck of dust swirls off her geometry homework in a cold draft. No, the idea isn't comforting. It hurts. Focus, she tells herself. I think I know what to do. As the sun sets and the ghostly hour strengthens her presence, Liz begins her work. She channels every ounce of her willpower to nudge the family Bible off the shelf, watching as it tumbles to the floor. With great effort, she kicks it toward the stairs and then drags it into the nursery. The act is exhausting. Moving physical objects as a ghost is no small feat, but she manages to place the Bible on the table near Sarah's crib. Next, she moves to her parents' bedroom. Hovering over her mother, Liz gently unclasps the crucifix from around her neck. Her mother stirs slightly but doesn't wake. For a fleeting moment, Liz considers waking her, trying to speak, to tell her that she's still here and that none of it was her fault. But no, she's tried that before. It doesn't work. It's too draining. Save your energy, she reminds herself. This is more important. Stomp, stomp, stomp. The footsteps come earlier than expected, breaking the night's stillness. Liz feels fear ripple through her, but she pushes it aside. Midnight has passed, marking the start of tomorrow. She clutches the silver crucifix in her ethereal grasp. It feels impossibly heavy, but she drags it and herself into the nursery, positioning herself between the crib and the door. The footsteps grow louder. The trifling thing is still here. The demon grates, sensing her presence. Will you watch and despair? Watch what? Liz asks, her voice trembling but steady as she stands her ground. The taking, it growls. Heat flares, and Liz feels her resolve waver as fear claws at her. What do you mean? She presses. The taking ... You mean possession, right? The word stumbles from her lips, each syllable laden with dread. The demon rumbles a low, menacing growl. Why, Sarah? Liz demands, her voice rising. Go away. The entity's tone shifts, incredulous. Away, you dare to command, it snarls. I will not leave a vessel like this. Seldom is one born with so open a soul. Tonight, the opes decree she is ripe for the taking, and I shall take my place in her. The sulfuric heat in the room intensifies, a festering infection in the air. No, Liz says, her voice firm. She raises the tiny crucifix as if lifting a brick, her incorporeal strength stretched to its limit. A cold wind rushes through the room, fluttering the Bible open to a page in the book of Mark, where Jesus casts out unclean spirits. The demon growls in fury as Liz begins to read. She doesn't know if it will work. She only knows it has to. Stomp, stomp. The demon hesitates, its retreat reluctant. No, it rages, not tonight. I shall not be cast out. Stomp, a struggling step forward. Liz flings the crucifix toward the sound. It strikes the unseen entity with a sharp, low growl, but the presence doesn't stop. No. Liz screams, summoning every memory of her family's laughter, their smiles, and the joy she desperately wants to protect. Leave Sarah alone, she cries. In her mind, she pictures her mother's radiant smile as she watches over Sarah, her father's quiet joy. This is her family. It used to be hers too, but now all that matters is keeping them safe. Not my family, Liz whispers, her determination solidifying. She is mine. A blast of icy air cuts through the room. The demon howls in rage, hurling infernal curses into the void as the sulfuric stench and oppressive heat evaporate. The entity flees, its final retreat punctuated by the nursery door slamming shut. The nursery door slams shut behind the demon, and Sarah awakens abruptly, crying loud and shrill. Within moments, her parents come rushing down the hallway, their expressions groggy but laced with concern. They stumble into the room, Dad accidentally stepping on the discarded crucifix. He mutters a confused curse under his breath, while Mom pauses to glance at the Bible sitting conspicuously near the crib. Her brows furrow for a fleeting moment, but her attention quickly shifts to Sarah, who is wailing and thrashing in her crib. Before long, the confusion dissipates, and they are entirely focused on soothing their baby. Dad cradles Sarah gently while Mom hums a familiar lullaby. Soon, the crying softens into hiccuped coos as Sarah responds to their comforting gestures. The three of them huddle close, exchanging smiles and whispers as they dote on her. The room fills with warmth, a stark contrast to the earlier malevolent presence. Liz watches it all unfold, a bittersweet ache swelling in her chest. She exhales deeply, relieved that her family is safe, that she succeeded in protecting them. But as she sees their smiles and hears their laughter, she feels an overwhelming sense of exclusion. She stands just behind her mother, close enough to reach out, and instinctively places her translucent hand on her shoulder. Of course, she feels nothing. They can't sense her presence. They don't know what she's done for them. They don't even know she's there. The longing grows unbearable. Liz aches not just for acknowledgement, but to be part of their lives again, to sit with them, to be held by them, to bask in their love like she once did. The memory of being cherished flashes vividly in her mind, and her longing twists into something darker, something desperate. Then a thought flits through her mind, faint and nebulous at first, like a drifting cloud. Maybe they could. Her gaze shifts to the baby in her parents' arms. Sarah's soft giggles fill the room as her mother peppers her with kisses, and her father chuckles quietly at the scene. Liz feels a pang of envy. Her mind replays the demon's ominous words, an open soul. The phrase loops in her thoughts, gaining weight and clarity. Maybe they could look at me like that again. The cloudy thought solidifies into an idea. Her family's love isn't gone. It's simply been redirected. Maybe she could reclaim it. Maybe she could feel their warmth again, see their joy aimed toward her. The thought grips her, no longer faint, but a persistent whisper in her mind. She steps forward, her translucent form inching closer to the crib. Her gaze locks on Sarah, the baby's chubby face aglow with innocence and vulnerability. The air around Liz feels charged, as if the remnants of the demon's sulfuric presence linger, urging her forward. She takes another step, The phrase repeats in her mind, louder this time. An open soul. The family remains oblivious, engrossed in Sarah's laughter and coos. Liz's movements are slow, deliberate, almost hesitant. But the thought has taken root, and with every step, it grows stronger, more consuming. To take, Liz halts by the crib, her form shimmering faintly in the dim nursery light. Her nothingness reaches out, trembling, toward Sarah. The whispers in her mind swell to a deafening crescendo. Her family's love could be hers again. Their smiles, their attention, their warmth that could all belong to her once more. To take, the scene fades to black, the whispers echoing ominously into the void. The motel stranger. I was driving through a small town on my way to a work event when the rain started coming down in sheets. It was so heavy I could barely see a few feet in front of me. The narrow two-lane road had no streetlights, and the glare of my headlights on the rain-soaked asphalt made things worse. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, leaning forward as if that would help me see better. My GPS kept telling me there was still another hour to go, but I knew I couldn't keep driving in this storm. My eyes darted to the side of the road, searching for a place to stop. That's when I saw it, a small motel, its neon vacancy sign flickering against the dark. It didn't look like much, just a single-story building with a row of doors, but it was better than driving blind. I pulled into the lot and parked near the office. The rain was relentless as I dashed inside, my clothes and shoes soaked by the time I reached the door. The office was dimly lit, with old, mismatched furniture and a faint musty smell. Behind the counter stood a man, probably in his late 50s, with thinning hair and a tired expression. "Need a room?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. "Yes, just for the night," I said, trying not to drip too much water on the worn carpet. He handed me a key attached to a large plastic tag with the number 7 printed on it. "Cash only," he added, motioning toward an old register. I paid, thanked him, and hurried back to my car to grab my bag before heading to room 7. The rain pounded on the roof as I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was small and outdated, with faded wallpaper, a lumpy bed, and a TV that looked older than me. But it was dry, and that was all I cared about. After changing into dry clothes, I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to relax. The storm raged outside, the sound of rain and occasional thunder filling the room. I flipped through the few channels on the TV, settling on a rerun of some old sitcom. I was starting to feel drowsy when I heard a faint knock on the door. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't expecting anyone. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it, but then the knock came again, louder this time. I hesitated, my mind racing. Maybe it was the motel manager or someone who needed help because of the storm. But something about the timing felt off. Why would anyone be out in this weather? Who is it? I called out, my voice trembling slightly. There was no answer. I got up slowly, my bare feet brushing against the thin carpet as I approached the door. I peered through the peephole, expecting to see nothing, but there was someone there. A man stood just outside, his face partially hidden by the hood of a rain-soaked jacket. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at the door. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice firmer this time. Still no response. Every instinct I had screamed not to open the door. Instead, I backed away, locking the deadbolt and sliding the chain into place. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my phone, ready to call the front desk. Before I could dial, the knocking started again, louder, more insistent. My heart raced as I glanced back at the door. The man's shadow was visible under the thin strip of light coming from the hallway. "Go away," I shouted, hoping my voice sounded stronger than I felt. The knocking stopped abruptly, and for a moment, the only sound was the pounding rain. I held my breath, waiting. Then I heard footsteps retreating down the hallway. I waited a few minutes before peeking through the peephole again. The hallway was empty. Relieved, but still on edge, I called the front desk. The manager answered, and I quickly explained what had happened. "Did you see his face?" he asked, his tone more curious than concerned. Not really, I admitted. He had a hood on, the manager sighed. Probably a drifter looking for shelter. It happens sometimes. Just keep your door locked, and you'll be fine. His lack of concern didn't reassure me, but I thanked him and hung up. The rest of the night was a blur of anxiety. Every creak, every sound from outside made me jump. I barely slept, and as soon as the storm cleared the next morning, I packed up and left. As I checked out, the manager barely glanced up from his crossword puzzle. I got in my car and drove away, eager to put the motel and the stranger behind me. To this day, I wonder what would have happened if I had opened the door. The highway stalker. It happened on a stretch of highway I've driven more times than I can count. The road is long and quiet, bordered by woods on both sides, and at night, it feels endless. That night, I was driving home from visiting my sister. It was late, maybe a little after 11 p.m., and the road was empty. I don't mind driving alone at night. It's peaceful, and there's something calming about the sound of the tires on the pavement. But this time felt different. As I drove, I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. They were far back at first, just a pair of small lights in the distance. I didn't think much of it at first. Cars come and go, even on a quiet road like this. But as I continued driving, the headlights stayed in my mirror. They weren't gaining on me, but they weren't falling back either. It was as if they were matching my speed exactly. I told myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe the driver was going the same way I was. Still, the longer it went on, the more uneasy I felt. The car wasn't passing me, even when the road opened up with no oncoming traffic. It just stayed behind me, a constant presence in the dark. After about 20 minutes, I started to get nervous. My grip on the steering wheel tightened as I glanced at the mirror more frequently. I considered slowing down to let them pass, but something in my gut told me not to. Instead, I sped up, hoping to put some distance between us. For a moment, it worked. The headlights grew smaller in my mirror, and I let out a shaky breath. But then, I saw them again closer this time. The car had sped up too. Now, I was scared. My mind raced with possibilities. Was the driver following me, or was I just being paranoid? Either way, I didn't want to take any chances. I scanned the road ahead, looking for an exit or a gas station anywhere with people. But this part of the highway was deserted, nothing but trees and the occasional streetlight. Then, the car behind me did something that made my blood run cold. It flashed its high beams once, then again. The sudden bursts of light filled my car, and I felt my heart pound. What did they want? I kept driving, trying to stay calm, but my hands were shaking. The car behind me got closer, almost tailgating now. The high beams flashed again, and this time, they stayed on, blinding me through my mirrors. I panicked. I floored the gas pedal, pushing my car to go faster. The engine roared as I sped down the highway, but the other car kept up, its headlights glaring in my mirror. Up ahead, I spotted a rest area sign. Relief washed over me. I'd pull in, find other people, and figure out what to do. As I approached, I signaled and veered off the highway, pulling into the parking lot. The car behind me didn't follow. I parked under a bright light and sat there for a moment, trying to catch my breath. My hands were still gripping the steering wheel, and my heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. After a few minutes, I dared to look back at the highway. The car was gone. I didn't know where it went or why it had been following me, but I wasn't about to wait around to find out. I stayed in the rest area for a while, watching as other cars came and went. Eventually, I felt calm enough to get back on the road. The rest of the drive home was uneventful, but the feeling of being watched never quite left me. Even now, I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't pulled off the highway. The shadow in the hotel room, traveling for work, had become second nature to me. Most weeks, I'd find myself in a different city, bouncing between hotels and conference centers. While it could be exhausting, there was a certain rhythm to it, checking in, unpacking just enough to get comfortable, and settling into whatever room I was assigned for the night. That week's trip was no different. I had a client meeting in a smaller city a few hours away and had booked a hotel that was convenient, if not exactly luxurious. The pictures online showed a charming older building downtown with brick walls and a vintage aesthetic. It looked quaint, and I figured it would be a nice change of pace from the sterile, modern hotels I usually stayed in. By the time I arrived, it was already late, just past 9 p.m. The drive had taken longer than expected due to heavy rain, and I was eager to check in and unwind. The hotel lobby was quiet, lit by warm, dim lights that gave it an old-world charm. The receptionist greeted me with a polite smile and handed me the key to my room on the 4th floor. The elevator ride up was smooth but slow, the old machinery groaning softly as it carried me to my floor. The hallway was narrow, with faded carpeting and sconces that flickered faintly. My room, for 117, was at the end of the corridor. When I opened the door, I was struck by how ordinary it was. A queen bed, a small desk by the window, and a bathroom tucked into the corner. The decor was dated, but clean, with muted colors and heavy drapes that gave the room a slightly gloomy atmosphere. I set my bag down and pulled the curtains open to let in some light from the street below. The view wasn't much, just a row of dimly lit shops and an empty sidewalk. Still, it made the room feel less closed off. After a quick shower, I changed into my pajamas and climbed into bed, propping myself up with pillows as I scrolled through my phone. The hum of the air conditioner filled the silence, and the soft glow from the window made the room feel cozier than I'd expected. I must have fallen asleep without realizing it, because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to a strange sensation. It wasn't a sound that woke me, exactly more like an awareness that something wasn't right. The room was silent except for the air conditioner, but there was a heaviness in the air that I couldn't explain. I turned my head toward the clock on the nightstand. 12:47 a.m. I shifted in bed, pulling the blanket closer, and that's when I saw it. There was a shadow on the far wall. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. The curtains were slightly open, and the streetlights outside could have been casting the shadow of a tree or a passing car. But this shadow was different. It was tall and humanoid, with broad shoulders and a narrow head. It didn't move, didn't flicker like shadows normally do when cast by something outside. It just stood there, perfectly still. My chest tightened as I sat up slowly, my eyes fixed on the shadow. I told myself it had to be something simple, a coat hanging on a chair, maybe, or a reflection from the window. But the longer I stared, the clearer it became. This wasn't a random shape, it was deliberate. "Hello," I whispered, my voice barely audible in the quiet room. The shadow didn't respond. It didn't move. I reached for my phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the wall where the shadow had been. There was nothing there. I let out a shaky breath, relief flooding over me. It had to have been my imagination, a trick of my tired mind. I turned off the flashlight and lay back down, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But as soon as the room went dark again, the shadow returned. This time, it was closer. It was no longer on the far wall. Now, it was at the foot of the bed. I sat up quickly, my pulse racing. The shadow loomed over the edge of the mattress, its outline sharper than before. I scrambled to turn on the bedside lamp, my hands trembling. Warm light flooded the room, chasing away the darkness. The shadow was gone. I stayed there, clutching the blanket, my eyes darting around the room. The window, the desk, the bathroom door, everything looked normal. But the unease wouldn't leave me. I decided to keep the lamp on. Lying back down, I stared at the ceiling, my body tense and my mind racing. The minutes crawled by, and just as I started to relax, the lamp flickered. The light dimmed for a moment, then steadied. I sat up, my heart pounding. The air in the room felt heavier now, thick and oppressive. I glanced toward the foot of the bed, half expecting the shadow to be there again. It wasn't, but then I noticed something worse. The bathroom door, which I had left open, was now ajar. I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. Had I closed it without realizing? or was someone in there? Summoning every ounce of courage, I slid out of bed and crept toward the door. My bare feet were silent on the carpet as I approached, my hand shaking as I reached for the doorknob. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking softly. The bathroom was empty. I let out a shaky laugh, relief mixing with the lingering fear. But as I turned to leave, I saw it again reflected in the bathroom mirror. The shadow was standing behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. That was enough for me. I grabbed my phone and my bag, not caring about anything I might have left behind, and bolted from the room. The hallway was silent, the dim sconces casting long shadows on the faded carpet. I didn't stop until I reached the lobby, where the receptionist looked up in surprise. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her expression concerned. "I need a different room," I said, my voice trembling. She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Of course. Let me see what we have available." She handed me a new key, and I spent the rest of the night in a room on the second floor. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I checked out early, barely meeting the receptionist's eye as I handed her the key. As I turned to leave, she hesitated. "Room for 117, she said quietly. "You're not the first guest to ask for a new room." Her words sent a chill down my spine, but I didn't ask for details. I just wanted to leave. Even now, I can't stop thinking about that shadow. Was it a trick of the light, my imagination, or something else entirely? I still travel for work, but I avoid older hotels whenever I can. Because whatever was in that room with me, it felt like it had been waiting. The shadow in the hotel room traveling for work can be both mundane and lonely. There's a rhythm to it: airports, rental cars, identical hotel rooms, but sometimes a moment breaks that rhythm in a way you never forget. That week, I had a business conference in a small city about 3 hours from home. I'd arrived late after a long day of meetings and driving. Exhaustion was creeping in as I parked at the hotel, a modest but charming building that looked like it had been around for decades. The lobby had a vintage feel: high ceilings, worn leather furniture, and a creaky wooden desk where an older receptionist handed me my room key with a polite, tired smile. I noted the key wasn't a card, but an actual metal key attached to a heavy brass tag. "Room for 117, she said, sliding the key across the desk. "Elevators are just down the hall." I thanked her, grabbed my bag, and made my way to the elevator. The hallways were dimly lit, and the patterned carpet muffled my footsteps. The faint smell of polish and something earthy, like damp wood, lingered in the air. When I reached my room, the door creaked softly as I opened it. The room was standard: a queen bed with a floral comforter, a desk and chair, a small flat-screen TV mounted on the wall, and a window overlooking the quiet street below. The furnishings were clean but dated, with a heavy oak dresser and a bedside lamp that flickered slightly when I turned it on. I dropped my bag near the desk, pulled back the curtains to let in a bit of light from the street lamps, and sat on the edge of the bed. The silence was profound. No hum of nearby guests, no traffic noise, just the faint ticking of an old-fashioned wall clock. After a quick shower, I climbed into bed. The mattress was firm, the comforter heavier than I expected, but the weight was oddly comforting. I scrolled through my phone for a while, letting the glow of the screen keep me company until my eyelids grew heavy. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke up with a start. At first, I didn't know what had woken me. The room was silent, the faint whir of the air conditioner the only sound. I glanced at the clock on the nightstand. 12:47 a.m. I shifted under the covers, turning to face the window. The curtains were slightly open, allowing a sliver of light from the street lamp to spill across the room. That's when I noticed it, a shadow on the far wall. At first, I thought it was nothing, a trick of the light or something outside casting a reflection. But the shadow didn't flicker or move like a passing car's headlights. It was still, tall, and humanoid. My heart began to pound. I told myself it had to be a shadow from outside, but as I stared at it, I realized it wasn't quite shaped like a person. The proportions were wrong, too tall, with elongated limbs that seemed to blur at the edges. I sat up slowly, My eyes locked on the shadow. "Hello," I whispered, my voice trembling. The shadow didn't move. Reaching for my phone, I fumbled to turn on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the wall where the shadow had been. There was nothing there. I let out a shaky breath, relief flooding over me. It had to be my imagination, a combination of exhaustion and the dim lighting. I turned off the flashlight and lay back down, determined to get some sleep. But as soon as the room went dark again, the shadow returned. This time, it wasn't on the far wall. It was at the foot of the bed. I froze, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might burst. The shadow was clearer now, its edges sharper. I could make out the shape of shoulders, a head, and arms that hung unnaturally long at its sides. My breath caught in my throat as I reached for the bedside lamp. The room flooded with warm light, and the shadow disappeared. I sat there for what felt like hours, clutching the edge of the blanket, my eyes darting around the room. Everything was still just the dresser, the desk, and the faint glow from the street outside. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the window, I hadn't slept. I packed my bag quickly, eager to leave the room and put as much distance between myself and whatever I had seen. When I reached the front desk to check out, the same receptionist was there, looking just as tired as the night before. "Everything okay with your stay?" she asked, her voice polite. I hesitated, debating whether to say anything. "Has anyone ever mentioned strange things in room 417? Her expression faltered, just for a moment. "Why do you ask?" I hesitated again. I thought I saw something, a shadow, maybe. I was probably just tired. The receptionist glanced around, as if checking to see if anyone else was listening. "This is an old building," she said quietly. "Sometimes guests report odd things, especially on the 4th floor. Her words sent a chill down my spine. I nodded, thanked her, and left without another word. Even now, years later, I can't forget the feeling of that shadow watching me. I've stayed in countless hotels since, but I avoid older ones whenever I can. Because whatever was in that room with me that night, I don't think it was just a trick of the light. The dog walker encounter every night after dinner. I take my dog Riley for a walk. It's been a part of my routine for years, a little slice of quiet time to unwind from the day. Riley loves it, of course. He's a Labrador mix with endless energy, and these walks give him a chance to sniff, explore, and burn off some of that boundless enthusiasm. My neighborhood is usually quiet, especially at night. It's one of those older, tree-lined places where streetlights are spaced far enough apart that shadows stretch long between them. The roads are empty most evenings, except for the occasional car passing by or another dog owner out for a stroll. That night started like any other. The air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of damp earth from a rain earlier in the day. The streets shimmered slightly under the streetlights, the pavement still drying. I wrapped Riley's leash around my wrist, his excitement tugging me forward as we started our usual route. We walked down my street first, passing the familiar houses with their neatly trimmed lawns and glowing porch lights. Riley was his usual curious self, pausing every few feet to sniff something invisible to me. I let him take his time. There was no rush, and I enjoyed watching how happy he was. As we moved further from home, the neighborhood grew quieter. The houses became fewer, and the spaces between the streetlights stretched longer. We reached the park near the edge of the neighborhood, a small, open space with a playground and a walking path that looped through a grove of trees. Riley always loved the park, so I let him lead the way onto the path. The stillness hit me as soon as we entered. The swings in the playground hung motionless, their chains creaking faintly in the breeze. The faint glow from the distant streetlights barely reached the path, leaving much of it in shadow. It was peaceful, but not in a comforting way. Riley didn't seem to notice. His tail wagged happily as he trotted ahead, his nose to the ground. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping into my chest. Maybe it was just the quiet too quiet, I told myself. As we made our way through the park, I heard it. Footsteps. They were faint at first, almost drowned out by the sound of Riley's paws crunching on the gravel. I stopped walking and turned, expecting to see someone else on the path behind us, but there was no one. The trees around the path were thick, their branches casting jagged shadows on the ground. I squinted, trying to see through the darkness, but there was nothing, just the trees swaying slightly in the breeze. "Come on, Riley," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. I tugged gently on his leash, and he followed, his nose still glued to the ground. We continued walking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Every now and then, I glanced over my shoulder, but the path remained empty. Riley seemed unbothered, so I tried to tell myself I was just being paranoid. Then the footsteps came again. This time, they were louder, more distinct. They didn't match my pace, and they weren't coming from behind us. They seemed to be coming from the trees to our left, just off the path. I stopped again, my pulse quickening. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No response. Riley stopped, too, his ears perking up as he stared into the shadows. His tail, which had been wagging moments ago, stilled. A chill ran down my spine. "Let's go," I said, tugging harder on the leash. Riley hesitated, his gaze still fixed on the trees, but he followed. My pace quickened as I glanced around, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The footsteps followed. They weren't constant, more like the sound of someone moving cautiously, trying to stay hidden. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. My hands tightened around the leash, and my heart pounded in my chest. When we reached the end of the park path and stepped onto the sidewalk, I let out a shaky breath. The streetlights felt like a lifeline, their glow pushing back the darkness of the trees. I glanced back at the park entrance, half expecting to see someone step out of the shadows. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw a figure. It was only a shadow, barely visible against the darkness of the trees, but it was there. It didn't move, just stood at the edge of the path watching. My stomach twisted with fear. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I pulled Riley close and started walking quickly down the sidewalk, my heart racing. The streets were empty, and the sound of my footsteps seemed to echo louder than usual. Every few steps, I glanced over my shoulder. The park grew smaller in the distance, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was still there, watching. When I finally reached my house, I was almost running. I unlocked the door with trembling hands, pulled Riley inside, and locked it behind me. I stood there for a moment, catching my breath and listening. The street outside was silent, no footsteps, no shadows, nothing. Riley seemed fine, already curled up on his bed like nothing had happened, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen or what I thought I'd seen. Was it just my imagination, or was someone really out there, following us? The next morning, I went back to the park during the day. It was sunny and bright, the complete opposite of the night before. Families were playing on the playground, and the path was full of joggers and other dog walkers. It felt safe, normal. But as I walked the same path Riley and I had taken, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The trees lining the path seemed darker, their branches thicker and more twisted than I remembered. I never saw anything unusual that day or on any other visit, but I changed our route after that. I started avoiding the park at night, sticking to the well-lit streets near my house. Even now, years later, I think about that night. I wonder who or what was in the trees. And I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't left the park when I did. The gas station lock-in. It was late, later than I had planned to be out. I'd spent the evening at a friend's house, and the time slipped away faster than I realized. By the time I left, the roads were almost empty, and the shops I passed were dark. The only lights came from the occasional street lamp and the distant glow of a gas station sign. I noticed my fuel gauge was dangerously low, the needle hovering just above E. I didn't want to risk running out of gas in the middle of nowhere, so I pulled into the gas station. It was a small, rundown place, one of those 24-hour spots, with flickering neon lights and a lone car parked by the pumps. As I stepped out of my car, I glanced around. The place felt deserted. The only sign of life was the bored-looking cashier sitting behind the counter inside. I started pumping gas, trying not to think about how isolated the station felt. The pump clicked, signaling it was done, and I went inside to pay. The cashier, a young guy with earbuds in, barely looked up as I handed him my card. The silence in the store was unnerving, broken only by the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. Just as I turned to leave, the cashier suddenly pulled out one earbud and called after me. "Hey, you're not leaving yet, are you?" I froze, my hand on the door. Yeah, I said, turning back to look at him. "Why?" He hesitated, glancing toward the darkened windows. "There's been something weird going on tonight. You should stay inside for a bit." My stomach tightened. "What do you mean, weird?" He rubbed the back of his neck, clearly uncomfortable. "I don't know how to explain it. A couple of people came in earlier saying they saw someone. Or something hanging around the pumps. But every time I checked, there was nothing there." I stared at him, unsure whether to believe him or chalk it up to a bad joke. "What did they see?" I asked. He shrugged. "I don't know. They just said it was off. Like it wasn't moving right or something." A cold shiver ran down my spine. I glanced back at the windows, but the lot outside was empty. The gas station sign flickered, casting faint shadows across the pavement. "Look," the cashier said, lowering his voice. "I'm not trying to scare you, but if I were you, I'd wait a little while before going back out there." Just to be safe, I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to laugh it off and leave, but something about his expression, about the way he kept glancing at the windows, made me stay. "Okay," I said finally, stepping away from the door. "I'll wait." He nodded, relieved, and gestured toward the small seating area in the corner. "You can sit over there." I walked over and sat down, feeling the tension settle in my chest. The minutes ticked by, and nothing happened. The store remained quiet, and the lot outside stayed empty. I started to feel foolish for letting a stranger's vague warning get to me. But then I heard it, a faint sound, like something scraping against the pavement. It was so quiet at first that I thought I'd imagined it, but then it grew louder, closer. The cashier froze, his eyes darting toward the windows. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, my throat dry. The scraping sound continued, steady and deliberate. Suddenly, the fluorescent lights flickered, and the sound stopped. The silence was deafening. "Stay here," the cashier said, grabbing a flashlight from under the counter. Before I could protest, he walked to the door and peered outside. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The seconds stretched on, and I waited for him to say something. Finally, he turned back to me, his face pale. "There's nothing out there," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. I wanted to believe him, but the unease in his expression made it clear he wasn't sure. "I think I should just leave," I said, standing up. "Wait," he said quickly. "At least let me watch while you go to your car." I hesitated, then nodded. Together, we walked to the door. He unlocked it and held it open, keeping the flashlight trained on the lot. I stepped outside, my eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The air felt heavy, and every step toward my car made my skin crawl. When I reached my car, I fumbled with the keys, my hands trembling. I opened the door, slid into the driver's seat, and locked the doors in one motion. The cashier stood in the doorway, his flashlight still pointed at me. I waved to thank him and started the engine. As I pulled out of the lot, I glanced in my rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw something, a figure in the shadows, just at the edge of the gas station's lights. But when I looked again, it was gone. I drove away as fast as I could, my heart racing the entire way home. To this day, I don't know what the cashier saw or what I might have seen in the mirror. All I know is that I'll never stop at that gas station again. The late-night knock living in the countryside has always been a dream of mine. There's a stillness out here that you can't find in the city, a kind of peace that seeps into your bones. My house sits on the edge of a wide, open field, bordered by a dense line of trees. It's a small, cozy place, perfect for someone like me who loves solitude. That night, I was alone. My partner was out of town for work, and while the silence of the house felt heavier than usual, I didn't mind. I'd spent the evening curled up on the couch with a book and a steaming mug of tea, the soft glow of the lamp casting warm light across the room. By the time I glanced at the clock, it was almost midnight. I yawned, setting my book down and stretching. Outside, the night was quiet, the kind of deep silence that only exists in the middle of nowhere. I was about to turn off the lights and head to bed when I heard a knock at the door. It was soft, almost hesitant, but in the stillness of the house, it sounded impossibly loud. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. Who would be knocking at this hour? For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it. Maybe it was just the wind or the creak of the old house settling. But then it came again, 3 deliberate, measured knocks. I stood slowly, my blanket slipping to the floor. My first instinct was to check the doorbell camera, but I'd been meaning to fix it for weeks. I crept toward the door, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. "Hello," I called out, my voice wavering slightly. There was no response. The house suddenly felt much colder, the warm comfort of moments ago replaced by a growing unease. I hesitated before peeking through the peephole, expecting to see nothing but the dark expanse of the porch. Instead, I saw a figure. They were standing just beyond the glow of the porch light, their features obscured by shadow. I couldn't make out their face, but I could tell they were tall and hunched slightly, as if trying to hide. "Who's there?" I called out, louder this time. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. I stepped back from the door, my heart pounding. My phone was on the coffee table in the living room, and I considered grabbing it to call anyone but before I could move. The knocks came again. This time, they were harder, more insistent. "Go away," I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. The knocks stopped abruptly, leaving the house in heavy silence. I stayed frozen in place for what felt like hours, my ears straining for any sound. Finally, I worked up the courage to grab my phone and dialed my partner. The call went straight to voicemail. "Hey," I said, my voice trembling. "Something weird just happened." Someone knocked on the door, but they didn't say anything. "I'm fine, but just call me when you get this." I hung up and set the phone down, staring at the door. The figure was gone, at least as far as I could tell. I decided to check the locks one more time before heading upstairs. I was halfway up the stairs when I heard it again, a soft tapping sound, this time at the back door. My blood ran cold. I turned slowly, my eyes fixed on the dark hallway leading to the kitchen. The tapping came again, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone was knocking just lightly enough to get my attention. I wanted to run, to lock myself in my room and hide, but something compelled me to move toward the kitchen. The back door has a small window near the top, just big enough to see outside. As I approached, I could make out the faint outline of a hand pressed against the glass. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The hand slid downward slowly, leaving a streak on the glass before disappearing entirely. I backed away, fumbling with my phone as I dialed 911. The operator's calm voice was a lifeline, grounding me as I stammered out what was happening. "There's someone outside," I whispered, glancing nervously toward the back door. "They knocked on the front door earlier, and now they're at the back. Stay on the line," the operator said. "Officers are on their way." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me, and backed into the living room. My eyes darted between the front door and the hallway to the kitchen, my body tense with fear. Minutes passed like hours. The house was silent again, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. Finally, I saw the flash of red and blue lights through the window. A knock at the front door made me jump, but when I looked through the peephole, I saw a uniformed officer standing on the porch. I opened the door quickly, relief flooding through me. "Are you all right?" he asked, stepping inside. "I think so," I said, my voice shaky. I don't know who it was, but they were knocking on the doors. I saw someone. At the back door, the officer nodded and motioned to his partner, who began searching the perimeter of the house. When they returned, they hadn't found much, just a set of footprints in the soft dirt near the back door. Looks like they left when they saw us pull up, the officer said. We'll patrol the area tonight, but you should keep your doors locked and call us if anything else happens. I thanked them as they left, though their reassurances didn't do much to calm my nerves. That night, I didn't sleep. Every creak of the house made me jump. Every shadow seemed to shift. Even now, I can't forget the image of that hand on the glass or the way the figure lingered just outside the light. I still live in that house, but I never feel completely alone anymore. The grocery store encounter last week. I made my usual trip to the grocery store. It was an ordinary day, nothing unusual, and I wasn't in any rush. The parking lot was packed, so I ended up leaving my car near the back. I didn't mind the walk. In fact, I liked it. It gave me a small moment of quiet before diving into the errands. Inside, the store was as busy as I expected. It took me longer than usual to pick up everything on my list. By the time I left, the sky had darkened, and the faint glow of streetlights lit up the parking lot. The light wasn't very effective. It cast a dim, eerie half-glow that made everything feel just a little strange. I made my way back to my car, not particularly paying attention to my surroundings. As I approached, I noticed a piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. It was bright yellow, the kind of flyer you'd expect to see advertising a local car wash or community event. Without much thought, I placed my bags in the back seat and walked around to grab it. The flyer was stuck tight, and I had to tug at it a few times. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. They weren't distant, they were startlingly close. I froze, the flyer still in my hand, and slowly turned my head. Standing just a few feet away was a man. He wasn't carrying anything, didn't look like an employee, and for a few seconds, he didn't say a word. He just stared at me. He was dressed casually, jeans, a jacket, dark hair, but something about the way he stood there felt wrong, like a warning bell going off in my head. Finally, he spoke. "Hey," he said in a low, calm voice. "Need help with something?" I shook my head quickly, forcing out the words, "No, I'm good, thanks." My voice sounded steadier than I felt, but my heart was already pounding. He didn't smile, didn't move, just continued to watch me as though he was waiting for something. Trying to shake off the unease, I turned back toward my car and tossed the flyer onto the passenger seat. As I reached for the door handle, I felt his hand grab my arm. His grip wasn't overly aggressive, but it was firm, deliberate, and sent a jolt of panic through me. "You're coming with me," he said, his tone calm, but carrying an unsettling authority that made my stomach drop. "No, I'm not," I said, yanking my arm hard. My panic grew as he didn't let go. I tried to pull away, but he was much stronger than I anticipated. Then I noticed a white van parked just a few spaces down. It was an older model, the kind with no windows in the back. The sight of it sent cold fear rushing through me. I knew I couldn't let him get me near that van. I screamed, as loud as I possibly could, not caring how I sounded. The man flinched but didn't release his grip. He started pulling me toward the van, and it terrified me even more. His movements felt calculated, like he'd done this before and knew how to handle resistance. Desperation took over. I kicked and twisted with everything I had, but his grip stayed firm. That's when I remembered my keys. They were in my pocket, and with trembling fingers, I managed to grab them. Without thinking, I swung them as hard as I could, jabbing the sharp end into his hand. For the first time, he reacted. He yelled out, his grip loosening just enough for me to pull free. I stumbled backward, nearly falling, before I turned and ran. I bolted toward the store entrance, screaming for help, my voice trembling and uneven. A man near the door ran toward me, asking what was wrong. Between gasps, I managed to explain. He tried to grab me, by my car. The man didn't hesitate. He turned and started heading toward the parking lot, shouting for the guy to stay where he was. I followed at a distance, but when we reached my car, the man and the van were gone. My groceries were still sitting in the back seat, and my keys were on the ground where I dropped them during the struggle. The man who helped me stayed until the police arrived. I filed a report detailing everything I could remember about the man and the van. The officers assured me they'd review the security footage, but I haven't heard back from them yet. I still don't know who he was or why he chose me, but the experience has left me shaken. I've never been that scared in my life. One thing's for sure, I'll never park at the back of a lot again. News story is coming. This happened in the late 1990s, specifically in 1997. I never imagined that my love for solitude would lead me into such a predicament. At the time, I was stationed at Olympic National Park in Washington State. My name is Thaddeus Langley, though folks just call me Thad. I've always been drawn to the wilderness, a place where a person can hear their own thoughts without the constant buzz of city life. Growing up in a small town taught me to appreciate the simple things, like a good cup of coffee and a bad joke. It was a crisp autumn morning when I set out on what should have been a routine patrol through one of the less traveled sections of the park. The area wasn't popular with tourists, which suited me just fine. I packed my gear, just the essentials: a first aid kit, water, some trail mix, and a flashlight. As I shouldered my backpack, I caught a whiff of pine and damp earth, the smell of the forest awakening my senses. The canopy above was thick, filtering the sunlight into a soft green glow that made everything feel alive. The familiar crunch of leaves and twigs beneath my boots was oddly comforting as I ventured deeper into the woods. Birds chirped their morning songs, and occasionally I'd spot a squirrel darting up a tree trunk. A couple of hours into my hike, I stumbled upon something unusual. At first, I almost missed it, my eyes scanning the forest floor for any signs of disturbance. But as I looked up, my breath caught in my throat. On the trunks of several trees were deep gouges, claw marks, unlike anything I'd seen before. I approached the nearest tree and ran my fingers along the grooves. They were higher than any bear could reach and spaced too closely to be the result of antlers rubbing against the bark. The wood was splintered and torn, as if something with immense strength had raked its claws down the trunk in a frenzy. A chill ran down my spine despite the warmth of the day. I took a few photos with my phone, making a mental note to report it back at the station. But as I continued my patrol, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The usual sounds of the forest birdsong and rustling leaves had fallen silent. It was as if the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. I laughed at myself, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. "Get a grip, Thad," I muttered. "You're letting your imagination get the better of you." But even as I said the words, I couldn't quite convince myself they were true. As the day wore on, the silence became more pronounced. I found myself straining to hear any sound, a bird call, the scurrying of small animals, anything to break the eerie quiet. But there was nothing, just the sound of my own breathing and the occasional snap of a twig beneath my feet. Around midday, I reached a small clearing where I planned to have lunch. The open space should have been a relief after the densely packed trees, but instead, it felt exposed. As I unwrapped my sandwich, I noticed an unnatural stillness. No wind. No insects buzzing. Nothing. I took a bite of my sandwich, but it tasted like ash in my mouth. My eyes kept darting to the tree line, searching for what? I didn't know. But every instinct I had was screaming that something wasn't right. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a large figure darting between the trees, too fast for me to get a clear look. My heart leapt into my throat. "Probably just a deer," I muttered, though I wasn't convinced. The figure had seemed too large, too wrong to be a deer. I decided it was time to head back. As I packed up, a pungent odor hit me like a physical force. It was a mix of wet dog and decaying meat, so strong it made my eyes water. I gagged, covering my nose with my sleeve. Scanning the area, I saw nothing out of the ordinary, but the feeling of being watched was undeniable. With shaking hands, I shouldered my pack and set off back down the trail. Every snap of a twig and every rustle of leaves had me spinning around, sure I was about to come face to face with something. But each time, there was nothing. On the trail back, I found footprints in the soft ground. They were huge, unlike any animal tracks I'd ever seen before. They were elongated, with what looked like for toes ending in sharp points. I took a photo, my hands trembling as I held the phone. Whatever had made these prints was no ordinary forest creature. I pressed on, my pace quickening with each step. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees looming overhead like silent sentinels. The light was fading now, shadows lengthening and deepening. Every shape seemed to hide a potential threat. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the trees. I froze, my blood turning to ice in my veins. It wasn't human, but it didn't sound entirely animal either. It was a sound of rage and hunger, of something ancient and primal. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I tried to pinpoint the direction of the sound, but it seemed to come from everywhere at once, reverberating off the trees. Then I saw it. A massive creature emerged from the shadows about 50 yards ahead. It stood upright, at least 8 feet tall, with matted fur the color of ash. Its limbs were long and sinewy, ending in clawed hands that looked capable of tearing through steel. Its limbs were long and sinewy, ending in clawed hands that looked capable of tearing through steel. Its head resembled that of a hyena, but grotesquely distorted jaws too large, teeth too numerous. I froze, unable to move or even breathe. The creature locked eyes with me, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Its sickly yellow eyes burned with an unsettling intelligence that sent shivers down my spine. This was no mindless beast. There was something horrifyingly human in its gaze. Then it snarled, peeling its lips back to reveal rows of jagged teeth, and it charged. Instinct took over as adrenaline surged through my body. I turned and ran as fast as I could. The trail twisted and turned, but I didn't dare look back. Behind me, branches snapped, and heavy footfalls grew louder. Its hot, rancid breath felt like it was just inches from my neck. Up ahead, I spotted a fallen tree leaning against a rocky outcrop, forming a small crevice. Without thinking, I dove into the gap, squeezing myself into the tight space. The creature thundered past, unable to stop its momentum. I pressed myself as far back into the crevice as I could, holding my breath. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure it would hear me. The sound of its movements slowed, and I heard it sniffing the air. It let out a guttural growl of frustration, a sound so primal it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as I remained cramped and trembling. My muscles ached, but I didn't dare move. The creature paced back and forth, its claws scraping against the rocks. It knew I was nearby. Eventually, the noises faded, and the forest fell silent once more. I strained my ears, trying to determine if it was safe to emerge. The oppressive quiet of the forest offered no answers. Summoning every ounce of courage, I cautiously crawled out of my hiding spot. Every nerve in my body was on edge. The forest seemed different now, menacing. Shadows twisted and danced at the edges of my vision, and every sound made me flinch. I grabbed a sturdy branch and held it tightly. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was better than nothing. As I made my way back along the trail, I stumbled upon a scene that will haunt me forever. 3 hikers lay scattered across the path, their bodies torn and lifeless. Blood stained the ground, dark and rusty red. My stomach churned as I recognized one of them, Eric. He had checked in at the station that morning, eager to explore. His face was frozen in a mask of terror, his wide eyes staring at nothing. A surge of anger mixed with fear welled up inside me. These people never had a chance. Fumbling with my radio, my hands shook so badly I nearly dropped it. "This is Ranger Langley," I said, my voice barely steady. "Emergency in Sector 4. We have casualties." "I need immediate backup." The reply crackled through static, the words garbled. All I managed to make out was ... coming. Stay, before the line went dead. Knowing help might be on the way, I resolved to search for survivors. As I combed through the area, trying to ignore the carnage around me, I heard a faint groan. Hope surged through me, and I rushed toward the sound. One of the hikers, a woman in her 30s, was alive barely. Deep gashes covered her torso, and her breathing was shallow. "Hang in there," I said, kneeling beside her and applying pressure to her wounds. "Help is coming." Her eyes fluttered open, glassy with pain. It came. Out of nowhere, she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know," I replied, trying to keep my tone calm. "Just stay with me. You're going to be okay." She nodded weakly before her eyes closed again. I checked her pulse, praying for some sign of life, but there was nothing. She was gone. I sat back, my hands bloodied, and felt a wave of helplessness crash over me. These people had come to the park for adventure and beauty, only to meet a horrific end. Something had to be done. Every instinct told me to flee, to put as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. But I couldn't leave, not knowing it was still out there. Gathering my resolve, I decided to lure it away from any populated areas. It wasn't a brilliant plan, but it was the only one I had. I picked up another branch and fashioned a makeshift torch, wrapping it with dry grass and striking my lighter. The flame sputtered to life, casting flickering shadows around me. "All right, ugly," I muttered, trying to psych myself up. "Let's finish this." Waving the torch above my head, I shouted at the top of my lungs. My voice echoed through the forest, shattering the eerie silence. The creature didn't take long to appear. Its glowing eyes reflected the firelight with a sinister gleam as it stepped out from the shadows. It snarled, saliva dripping from its massive jaws, and charged again. This time, I stood my ground. At the last moment, I sidestepped and swung the torch, striking it across the face. The flames caught on its fur, and it recoiled, shrieking in pain and rage. Seizing the opportunity, I ran deeper into the woods, away from the main trails. The creature followed, its roars filled with fury. I could hear it crashing through the underbrush, gaining ground. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but I kept going. Ahead of me, the ground dropped off sharply a ravine. I remembered from earlier patrols a steep drop into rocky terrain ahead. With the creature closing in, I knew I had one shot. I leapt across the gap, my body suspended in the air for what felt like an eternity. I landed hard on the other side, my ankle twisting with a sickening pop. A jolt of pain shot up my leg, but there was no time to dwell on it. Behind me, the creature skidded to a halt at the edge, its momentum nearly carrying it over. For a moment, it teetered, claws scrambling for purchase on the loose soil. Our eyes met, and in that instant, I saw something unexpected: fear. Then, the ground beneath it gave way. The creature plummeted into the ravine below, its scream of rage morphing into one of terror as it fell. The sound echoed off the rocks before it was abruptly silenced. I limped to the edge, my heart pounding, and looked down. The creature lay motionless among the jagged rocks, its body twisted at unnatural angles. I couldn't tell if it was dead, but it wasn't getting up anytime soon. Exhausted and in pain, I turned back toward the station, using the trees for support. Every step was agony, but adrenaline kept me moving. As I emerged from the forest, I saw a team of rangers and emergency personnel waiting. Relief washed over me, and my legs finally gave out. "Thad, over here," someone called. I collapsed to the ground, the world spinning around me. Medics rushed over, checking my injuries and bombarding me with questions. My supervisor, Mark, knelt beside me, his face etched with concern. "What happened out there?" he asked urgently. "There's something in the ravine, about 2 miles east," I managed between labored breaths. "It attacked some hikers. They're gone." Mark exchanged glances with the others, his expression unreadable. "We'll send a team to investigate," he said. "Right now, let's get you taken care of." As they loaded me into an ambulance, I couldn't stop wondering what they would find, or if they would find anything at all. The forest had kept its secrets for millennia. Who was I to think I could uncover them in a single day? A few days later, I returned to the station. My ankle was wrapped, my arm in a sling from scratches I'd sustained. The official report listed the incident as a bear attack, but I knew better. When I pressed the higher-ups about what they'd found in the ravine, they gave me the usual bureaucratic runaround. "Let it go, Thad," Mark advised one evening as we closed up the office. "Sometimes it's better not to dig too deep." I wanted to argue, to demand answers, but the look in his eyes stopped me. There was something there, fear, maybe, or resignation. He knew more than he was letting on, but for reasons I couldn't fathom, he wouldn't or couldn't share it. I decided to take his advice, at least for now. Fighting management was like trying to teach a pig to sing. It wasted my time and annoyed the pig. That night, as I was leaving the station, I found a note slipped under the door. The paper was old and yellowed, the handwriting shaky, but legible. It read, "Be careful in the woods. Not everything is as it seems. The old ones are waking." I chuckled, though it was a hollow sound. "No kidding," I muttered, pocketing the note. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone watching from the shadows, but the parking lot was empty save for my beat-up truck. As I drove home, the words from the note echoed in my mind. The old ones are waking. What did that mean? And who had left the message? A sinking feeling settled in my stomach. My encounter in the woods felt like the beginning of something far larger and more terrifying than I could comprehend. The next morning, despite my injuries and the lingering fear, I was back on patrol. As I walked the familiar trails, I kept my senses sharp, but the forest seemed normal again. Birds sang, leaves rustled in the breeze. It was as if the horrors of a few days ago had never happened, like a bad dream. About an hour into my patrol, Dave, another ranger, caught up with me. "Heard you had quite the adventure," he said with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You could say that," I replied, unsure how much he knew. "Think about taking some time off?" He asked, his tone casual, though his eyes searched my face. I shook my head. "Nah, the trees would miss me too much." He laughed, but it sounded forced. "You're a glutton for punishment, Thad." "Better than a desk job," I shot back, trying to keep things light. We continued down the trail, sunlight filtering through the canopy above. Life went on, as it tends to do, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest held more secrets than I would ever know. As we reached a fork in the trail, Dave turned to me, his expression suddenly serious. "You sure you want to keep doing this, Thad? After what happened?" I hesitated. The memory of the creature, its inhuman eyes, razor-sharp claws, and snarling maw flashed through my mind. But beneath the fear, there was something else, curiosity. A burning need to understand what was really going on in these woods. "I have a knack for finding trouble," I said finally, managing a wry smile. "Might as well put it to good use." Dave studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, then. Adventure awaits." We headed down the path, the possibilities of the day stretching before us. Yet, as we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The forest seemed to close in around us, shadows deepening despite the bright afternoon sun. "Dave," I said quietly, not wanting to alarm him, "does anything feel off to you?" He glanced at me, his grin gone. "Yeah," he murmured. "It does." Dave's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice low and cautious. I was about to explain when a sharp crack of twigs snapping echoed from somewhere to our left. We both froze, our eyes scanning the dense underbrush. For a moment, the forest was utterly still, as if it too was holding its breath. Then, without warning, a figure burst through the trees. It was a man, or what was left of one. His clothes hung in tatters, his pale, mottled skin streaked with dark bruises. But it was his eyes that froze me in place. They were entirely black, no whites, no iris, just pools of inky darkness. "Help me," he rasped, stumbling toward us with jerky, unnatural movements, as if his body wasn't fully under his control. Dave instinctively took a step back, his hand moving to the radio on his belt. But before he could call for help, the man lunged at him with inhuman speed. I reacted on pure instinct, tackling the figure to the ground. The two of us tumbled, the smell of decay hitting me like a physical blow. I struggled to pin him, but his strength was impossible, far beyond what his frail, emaciated frame should have allowed. "Dave," I shouted, my voice strained, "get help." But Dave stood frozen, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror. The man, if he could still be called that, thrashed beneath me, his mouth opening unnaturally wide to reveal rows of jagged, sharpened teeth. Just as I felt my grip slipping, a gunshot rang out. The man's body went limp, and a dark, viscous fluid seeped from a hole in his head. I scrambled backward, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. Dave stood there, his service weapon in hand, shaking violently. What the hell was that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. I shook my head, unable to speak. The body on the ground was already starting to decompose at an alarming rate. Flesh melted away like wax under a flame, exposing bone beneath. We need to report this," Dave stammered, fumbling for his radio again. Before he could call, a strange, low hum filled the air. It was a pulsing sound, deep and resonant, that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. The air shimmered around us, distorting like heat waves on asphalt. "Dave," I said, a note of urgency creeping into my voice. "We need to leave. Now." He nodded, and we turned to run, but the forest around us had changed. The once familiar paths twisted into a labyrinth of shifting shadows and gnarled roots. The trees themselves seemed alive, closing in as if to trap us. Branches whipped at our faces, and roots caught at our feet, trying to trip us. The hum grew louder, drowning out the sound of our labored breaths and pounding footsteps. Then the ground gave way beneath us. We tumbled down a steep incline, rolling over rocks and through underbrush, until we finally came to a stop in a clearing. I groaned, battered and bruised, as I pushed myself up. Dave was beside me, clutching his arm where a jagged tear in his sleeve revealed bloodied skin. The clearing was unlike anything I'd seen in the park before. A towering cabin stood near the edge of a small creek. It was weathered and ancient, the wood blackened with age and covered in moss. Despite its appearance, there was something unnatural about it. The air around the cabin was heavy, charged with a presence I couldn't quite explain. "What is this place?" Dave whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't know," I replied, but my gut told me we shouldn't be there. The hum that had pursued us began to fade, replaced by an oppressive silence. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was a void, an emptiness that felt alive. I gestured for Dave to follow me as I limped toward the cabin. The pain in my ankle was excruciating, but fear outweighed the discomfort. The door creaked open with an unsettling ease, revealing a dark interior illuminated only by faint shafts of moonlight streaming through broken windows. Dust hung in the air, thick and undisturbed, but the room didn't feel abandoned. There was something here watching. We stepped inside cautiously. The floor creaked under our weight, the sound impossibly loud in the stillness. The walls were lined with shelves holding strange objects, bottles filled with murky liquids, carved wooden idols, and bundles of dried herbs that gave off a faint, acrid scent. In the center of the room was a table, and on it lay an open book, its pages covered in strange symbols I couldn't decipher. "What is this?" Dave muttered, reaching for the book. "Don't touch it," I hissed, grabbing his arm. Before we could decide our next move, a sound shattered the silence, a low growl, guttural and wet, coming from somewhere deep within the cabin. My blood turned to ice. "We need to leave," I whispered. But as we turned to go, the door slammed shut behind us, plunging the room into darkness. I figured it was probably a deer or a bear. I'd had a few run-ins before, nothing serious, but something felt off. It was that gnawing uneasiness you can't shake once it settles in your gut. I grabbed my rifle, an old Winchester .30 to 30 that had been my companion in these woods for decades. The weight of it in my hands was reassuring as I stepped off the porch, scanning the tree line. Nothing. The forest was unnaturally quiet to quiet. Normally, you'd hear crickets, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, maybe the distant hoot of an owl. But tonight, the woods were utterly still, as though they were holding their breath. I let it go, chalking it up to my imagination. Living out here, you hear things all the time. Sometimes your mind plays tricks on you. I went back inside, thinking the night was over. But just as I closed the door, there it was again, this time closer. I hesitated, my heart thudding against my ribs, and listened to the stillness settle over the woods. The sound wasn't moving away, it was getting nearer. I turned off the lights inside and peered out the window. The forest was dense, shadows crowding the spaces between trees, and without a clear line of sight, I couldn't see much. But I could feel something. Something was out there, watching. I'm not one to spook easily, not after years living in isolation. I've seen wolves stalk prey through these woods and heard coyotes howl under the moon. But this was different. The silence was unnatural, the air charged with tension that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I stepped back onto the porch, gripping the rifle tightly. "Who's out there?" I called, my voice sounding strange in the stillness to loud, to human. Silence, the kind that stretches too long. Then, movement. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. A tall, gaunt figure stood at the edge of the clearing, half shrouded by shadows. It didn't move like a person, it was too still, as though it was trying to blend into the darkness. I raised the rifle, aiming at the figure. "I don't know who you are, but I suggest you turn around and leave," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. My heart was racing. I'd dealt with trespassers before, poachers or drifters looking for shelter, but this wasn't that. This felt wrong. The figure took a step forward, slow, deliberate, then another. My pulse quickened. That primal, gut-deep fear clawed its way up my spine. Something was telling me to run. The figure stopped about 20 yards from the porch, and now I could see it more clearly. Its limbs were thin, impossibly long, like something out of a child's nightmare. Its skin was pale and translucent in the moonlight, tinged with a sickly gray that made my stomach churn. It was naked, but its body was twisted, a grotesque parody of human form. And its face was worse. Where eyes should have been, there were only deep, empty sockets, dark hollows that seemed to drink in the light. Its mouth was a thin, lipless line stretching unnaturally wide, almost ear to ear. And then, as I watched, it smiled. That smile will haunt me forever. It wasn't human, not joy, not warmth. It was a predator's grin, rows of needle-sharp teeth glinting in the moonlight. I pulled the trigger. The crack of the rifle shattered the silence, echoing through the trees. The figure flinched, a dark stain blooming on its chest where the bullet struck, but it didn't fall. I know I hit it. I've been a good shot since I was a boy, but the thing barely reacted. Everything went still again, the kind of eerie silence where the world seems to hold its breath. Then it moved faster this time. It lurched toward me, gliding across the ground with jerky, unnatural movements, like a marionette controlled by an unsteady hand. I fired again, and again, each shot rang out, the recoil biting into my shoulder. But no matter how many bullets I put into it, the creature kept coming. Panic surged through me. This wasn't possible. Nothing could take that many shots and keep moving. I wasn't sticking around to find out what it wanted. I turned and bolted inside, slamming the door behind me and bolting it with trembling hands. My chest heaved as I pressed my back against the door, rifle still clutched tightly. Outside, I could hear it moving around the cabin, its footsteps, if they could be called that, dragged across the porch, accompanied by a wet, slithering noise that made my skin crawl. And then a knock, soft, slow, deliberate, thud, silence, thud. It wasn't trying to break down the door, it was toying with me. I backed away, my mind racing. I couldn't stay here. The only exit was the front door, and that thing was right on the other side. The windows were too small to climb through, and even if I managed to get out, I didn't know what I'd be running into. Thud. The sound came again, louder this time, and I realized with a sickening certainty that it wasn't going to leave. I scanned the room, desperate for something I could use. The wood stove burned hot, but there was no way I could open it and grab something fast enough. My only option was to make a run for the truck. The keys hung on a hook by the door. I grabbed them, taking a deep breath to steel myself. This was a terrible idea, but staying inside wasn't any better. "Here goes nothing," I muttered, bracing myself. I had no idea what this thing wanted, but I wasn't about to wait around to find out. Saying a quick prayer, a habit I'd long abandoned, I yanked the door open. The creature was right there, inches from me, its hollow, lightless eyes locking onto mine. That sickening grin stretched impossibly wide, and for a moment, I froze, fear choking me. The stench of decay hit me like a wave, and I could see now that its pale skin wasn't just ghostly, it was rotting, hanging from its skeletal frame like tattered cloth. My hand tightened on the rifle. I fired point blank, the muzzle flash illuminating its grotesque features. The creature staggered back, a guttural hiss escaping its throat as it retreated into the shadows. The bullet had torn a hole in its chest, but instead of blood, a thick, black ichor oozed from the wound, steaming in the cool night air. I didn't wait to see if it would recover. I bolted for the truck, my legs feeling heavy, each step stretching into an eternity. Behind me, that wet, slithering sound grew louder, closer. I threw myself into the driver's seat and fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely fit them into the ignition. Come on, I muttered, my voice cracking with desperation. The engine roared to life, its sound a lifeline in the oppressive silence of the forest. I slammed my foot on the gas, the tires spinning in the dirt before gripping. The truck lurched forward, and I risked a glance in the rearview mirror. What I saw made my blood run cold. The creature had emerged from the shadows, moving with impossible speed. Its limbs contorted unnaturally, bending and stretching in ways that defied the laws of nature. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly, locked onto me with a hunger that was horrifyingly human. I pressed the accelerator harder, the engine whining as the truck barreled down the narrow dirt road. Trees blurred past, branches scraping against the sides of the truck. The thing was keeping pace, its gangly, distorted frame loping alongside like a monstrous animal. Its rasping breath filled the air, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw its twisted figure drawing closer. Then, with a deafening crack, the windshield shattered. The creature had leapt onto the hood, its hollow eyes peering through the broken glass. Its elongated fingers, tipped with razor-sharp claws, dug into the metal, leaving deep gouges. Its lipless mouth opened impossibly wide, revealing rows of needle-like teeth glinting in the moonlight. I swerved violently, trying to shake it off. The truck rocked dangerously, two wheels lifting off the ground as I took a sharp turn to fast. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought I'd lose control, but the wheels slammed back down, and the truck kept moving. The creature clung to the hood like a spider, its face mere inches from mine. I grabbed the rifle from the passenger seat, aimed through the shattered windshield, and fired. The blast tore through its chest, sending it flying off the truck and into the ditch. I didn't stop to check if it was dead. I couldn't. I kept driving, my mind racing, struggling to comprehend what had just happened. It was gone, for now, but I knew it wasn't over. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't natural. It wasn't something that should exist in this world. And that terrified me more than anything else. I drove through the night, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror. Every shadow seemed to shift, every rustling tree threatening to reveal something worse. When the first rays of dawn broke the horizon, I pulled into the small town of Millbrook, about 60 miles from the cabin. My truck was battered, the windshield shattered, and deep claw marks scored the hood. It drew curious stares from the few early risers on the street. I parked in front of the diner, a place I'd stopped at occasionally on my way to and from the cabin. Stumbling out of the truck, I caught a glimpse of myself in the side mirror. I looked like hell. My clothes were torn, my face pale and hollow, dark circles under my eyes. The bell above the diner door jingled as I entered, and all conversation inside stopped. The patrons turned to stare. Betty, the waitress behind the counter, gasped when she saw me. She was a kind woman in her 50s, and I'd known her for years. "Robert, my God, what happened to you?" she exclaimed, rushing around the counter to guide me to a seat. I opened my mouth to explain, but stopped. Where could I even begin? How could I describe what I'd seen? Who would believe me, I settled on a half-truth. Had a bit of trouble up at the cabin, I muttered. Some kind of animal attack. Her eyes widened. An animal did that to your truck? Must have been one hell of a bear. I nodded, not trusting myself to say more. Could I use your phone? I asked. Need to call the sheriff. She pointed me toward the pay phone in the corner. I dialed with trembling fingers, the familiar crackle of the line a strange comfort. Sheriff Tom Hawkins answered on the second ring, his gruff voice steady and reassuring. Tom, it's Robert Jensen, I said, my voice shaking. I need your help, Tom. Something happened up at my cabin, I said, my voice trembling. Something in my tone must have tipped him off because Tom's usual casual demeanor disappeared. Robert, are you all right? Where are you? I'm at Betty's Diner in Millbrook, I said. Tom, I don't know how to explain what happened. You need to see it for yourself. Stay there, he said firmly. I'm on my way. As I waited, Betty brought me a steaming cup of coffee and a plate of eggs and toast. I hadn't realized how hungry I was until the food was in front of me. Mechanically, I ate, my mind spinning as I replayed the events of the night over and over. The other patrons in the diner kept glancing at me, their expressions a mix of curiosity and concern. About 40 minutes later, Tom's cruiser pulled up beside my battered truck. He stepped out and walked into the diner, his face etched with concern. Jesus, Robert, he said as he saw me. You look like you've been through hell. I nodded, feeling a lump rise in my throat. That's not far from the truth, Tom. He slid onto the stool next to me and waved off Betty's offer of coffee. Tell me what happened. Start from the beginning. I took a deep breath and told him everything, the strange noises, the unnatural silence, the creature I had encountered. As I spoke, I watched his expression shift. At first, there was disbelief, but it slowly morphed into concern, then to a kind of guarded fear. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time, rubbing a hand over his face. Robert, I've known you for years. You're not the kind of guy who spins tall tales or lets his imagination run wild. But what you're describing, it's hard to believe. I know, Tom, I replied. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I wouldn't believe it either. But it was real, and it's still out there. Tom leaned in closer, his voice lowering. Have you heard about the disappearances? A chill ran down my spine. Disappearances. Over the past few months, 3 hikers have gone missing in the national forest, he said, his voice grave. We sent out search parties. Nothing. It's like they vanished into thin air. The implications hit me like a punch to the gut. You think it's connected to that thing? He didn't answer right away. I don't know, he admitted. But we need to find out. We need to go back up there, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. We need to stop it. Tom shook his head. Not yet. You're in no condition to go anywhere. And if what you're saying is true, we're going to need more than just the 2 of us. He was right, of course. Exhaustion had caught up with me, and the adrenaline that had kept me going through the night had worn off, leaving me drained and shaky. Here's what we'll do, Tom said, his tone taking on the no-nonsense authority he was known for. You're going to get some rest. I'll put you up at the motel down the street. Meanwhile, I'll make some calls. I've got a friend in the state police who might be able to help. Tomorrow, we'll head up to your cabin with backup. I wanted to argue, but I knew he was right. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't going anywhere, and we'd need to be prepared. Tom drove me to the motel in his cruiser, leaving my truck at the diner for the local mechanic to look over. As he pulled up to the motel, he turned to me, his expression serious. Robert, I need you to promise me something. Don't talk about this to anyone else. The last thing we need is a panic on our hands, and be careful. Lock your door. If you see or hear anything strange, call me immediately, understand? I understand, I said, my voice heavy with exhaustion. Thanks, Tom. He clapped me on the shoulder. Get some rest. I'll pick you up first thing in the morning. I watched his cruiser pull away, feeling an uneasy weight settle in my chest. Whatever I had encountered in those woods, it wasn't done with me. The motel clerk gave me a curious look as I checked in, but thankfully didn't ask any questions. My room was small and plain, with faded floral wallpaper and a creaky bed. It wasn't much, but it felt secure. I locked and chained the door, drew the curtains, and sat on the edge of the bed, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Even in the middle of town, miles from the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the old building, every noise from the parking lot outside, made me jump. Despite my exhaustion, sleep didn't come easily. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with twisted shapes in the darkness, hollow eyes watching me, and that awful, inhuman smile. A sharp knock at the door jolted me awake. For a moment, I was back at the cabin, hearing that deliberate thudding on the porch. Panic gripped me. Then I heard Tom's voice calling my name. I opened the door to find Tom standing there, looking grim. Behind him were two men in state police uniforms. "Robert," Tom said, "this is Sergeant Mike Callahan and Officer Steve Reeves from the state police." The two officers nodded, their expressions a mix of skepticism and concern. I couldn't blame them. If I were in their shoes, I wouldn't believe me either. "I'd probably think this was a wild goose chase too," I admitted, trying to steady my voice. Tom gave me a long, measured look. "We're ready to head up to your cabin whenever you are," he said. "Are you sure you're up for this?" I nodded, trying to ignore the knot of fear twisting in my stomach. "I have to know, Tom. I can't just let this go." The drive back to my cabin was tense. I sat in the back of Tom's cruiser, the state police vehicle following close behind. With every mile, the shadows in the trees seemed deeper, every bend in the road more ominous. By the time we reached Pine Creek, my anxiety had built to a fever pitch. When we pulled into the clearing, everything looked normal at first glance. The cabin stood where I'd left it, the quiet surrounding it almost mocking. But there was a heavy, oppressive feeling in the air, a wrongness that made my skin crawl. Tom rested a hand on his holstered gun as he spoke. "All right, we'll do a sweep of the area. Robert, you stay close to me. Mike, Steve checked the perimeter." I followed Tom toward the cabin, my breath catching when I saw the porch. The door hung open, swaying slightly in the breeze, and deep gouges scarred the wooden planks where the creature had walked. Inside, the cabin was a mess. Furniture was overturned, and my belongings lay scattered where I'd knocked them over during my frantic escape. But the worst part was the marks long, parallel scratches carved into the walls and floor. No animal I'd ever encountered could have made those. What the hell could have done this? Officer Reeves muttered, running his fingers over one of the marks. Before I could respond, Sergeant Callahan's voice called out from the edge of the clearing. "Sheriff, you need to see this." We hurried outside to find Callahan standing just at the tree line. As I approached, I saw what had caught his attention. The underbrush was trampled, the trees scarred with more of those strange claw marks. A trail of black, oily substance snaked away into the woods, the same ichor I'd seen oozing from the creature's wounds. "It leads off that way," Callahan said, his voice tight. "Whatever did this, it's big." Tom turned to me, his expression grim. "Robert, I think it's time you told them everything. They need to know what we might be dealing with." So, for the third time, I recounted my terrifying encounter. As I spoke, I saw disbelief flicker in the officers' faces, only to be replaced by grim understanding. By the time I finished, the sun had dipped low in the sky, and long shadows stretched through the trees. "We should head back," Officer Reeves said, glancing nervously at the darkening woods. "Whatever this thing is, I don't want to be out here after dark." We started to turn back when a sound stopped us cold. "Help, is anyone there? Please, help me." The voice was faint at first, carried on the wind, but it grew louder, clearer. It was coming from deep within the woods. We exchanged uneasy glances. It was a man's voice, desperate and tinged with fear. "We can't ignore that," Tom said, his face set with grim determination. Someone could be in real trouble. Every instinct I had screamed at me to leave. But I couldn't, not when there was a chance someone needed help. And deep down, I knew I needed answers. We ventured into the forest, the voice guiding us deeper. The trees closed in around us, their skeletal branches blotting out the fading light. The air grew colder, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. "Help, over here," the voice called again, closer now. But there was something off about it, a quality I couldn't quite put my finger on. We moved in formation, Tom and I in the center, with Callahan taking point and Reeves covering the rear. Our footsteps sounded unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. No birds, no rustling leaves, just us and that haunting voice. "I've got a bad feeling about this," Reeves muttered. I couldn't have agreed more. Pushing through a dense thicket, we emerged into a small clearing. The voice had stopped. In the center of the clearing stood an ancient, gnarled tree, its bare branches clawing at the darkening sky. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness. "Hello," Tom called out, his voice echoing eerily. "We're here to help. Where are you?" Silence. Callahan moved toward the tree, his flashlight cutting through the growing darkness. Suddenly, he stopped, the beam fixed on something at the base of the tree. "Oh, Jesus," he breathed. We rushed to his side, and my stomach lurched at what I saw. Propped against the trunk was a man, or what was left of one. His skin was stretched tight over his bones, pale and mottled with decay. His eyes were sunken, lifeless pits, but it was his chest that drew our horrified gaze. It had been torn open, ribs splayed outward like a grotesque flower. The cavity within was empty, hollowed out completely. Reeves stumbled back, his face pale. What could have done this? Before anyone could answer, the voice came again, louder, sharper, and impossibly close. "Help me," I turned, my blood running cold. The voice hadn't come from the woods this time. It had come from the dead man at the base of the tree. "It's Jim Hawkins," Tom said, his voice barely above a whisper. The name hit me like a punch to the gut. Jim Hawkins had been missing for 3 weeks. Yet here he was, or what was left of him. As the shock of the gruesome discovery began to settle, another realization struck me. Despite being missing for weeks, the body showed no signs of decay. It looked fresh, as if he'd died only hours ago. Before any of us could comment, a twig snapped in the darkness beyond the clearing. We whirled toward the sound, weapons raised. "Who's there?" Callahan barked, his flashlight beam cutting through the tree line. For a long, tense moment, there was only silence. Then, a voice spoke. It was the same voice we had been following, but something had changed. Gone was the fear and desperation. Now, it was cold, mocking, and dripping with malice. "You came," it hissed, the words slow and deliberate. "Just as I knew you would." From the shadows, a figure emerged, and my blood turned to ice. It was the creature from my cabin. Its gaunt, elongated form was unmistakable. But now, under the harsh beam of Callahan's flashlight, I could see details I hadn't noticed before. Its pale, translucent skin pulsed faintly with a bioluminescent glow, and black, oily veins crisscrossed its body like some grotesque network. Its face was a nightmare, a too wide mouth stretched unnaturally across its elongated head, filled with needle-sharp teeth. "What in God's name?" Reeves gasped, his voice trembling. The creature's head snapped toward him, its empty sockets somehow focusing on the young officer. Then it spoke, its voice a rasping, guttural chuckle. "God," it said. "God has no dominion here." In a blur of motion, too fast to follow, the creature lunged at Reeves. His scream was cut short as its claws tore into him, and blood sprayed across the clearing. The rest of us opened fire, the deafening crack of gunshots shattering the silence. Bullets tore into the creature's flesh, spraying black ichor, but it didn't slow down. If anything, it seemed more enraged. It turned from Reeves' lifeless body, its grotesque form twisting and elongating. Its limbs bent at impossible angles, and its movements became more erratic, like a marionette controlled by a sadistic puppeteer. "Run!" Tom shouted, emptying his clip into the monstrosity. We didn't need to be told twice. We turned and bolted into the forest, the creature's inhuman laughter echoing behind us. Branches whipped at my face, roots seemed to grab at my feet, and that horrible wet, slithering sound grew closer with every step. Suddenly, Callahan cried out. I turned to see him fall, his leg caught in a tangle of roots. Tom and I skidded to a stop, rushing back to help him. But as we reached for him, the darkness behind Callahan seemed to move. The creature emerged from the shadows like a living nightmare. Its elongated arms wrapped around Callahan, lifting him off the ground. His scream of terror turned into a wet gurgle as those needle-like teeth sank into his throat. "Tom, we can't help him," I shouted, pulling at his arm. Tom hesitated, but the sight of the creature feasting on Callahan was too much. "We have to go." He yelled, and we ran, the sounds of the creature feeding burning into my memory. We burst out of the tree line near the cabin, gasping for breath. The truck was just ahead, our last hope of escape. But as we neared it, a chilling laugh froze us in our tracks. The creature stood between us and the vehicle. Blood dripped from its maw, and its shifting form seemed to shimmer in the dim light. "Did you think you could escape?" It hissed, its voice a symphony of whispers and hisses. "This forest is mine. You are mine." It stepped closer, and I realized with horrifying clarity that this wasn't a mere animal. This was something ancient, something that didn't belong in our world. We had stumbled into its hunting ground. Tom and I backed against the truck, weapons raised, though we both knew our guns were useless. "What are you?" I found myself asking, my voice barely audible. The creature tilted its head, an unsettlingly human gesture. Its terrible grin widened. "I am hunger," it said, its voice like wind rustling through dead leaves. "I am the darkness that lurks in the corners of your world. I am what you fear when you look into the shadows." It took another step forward, its form flickering as though it couldn't decide what shape to take. "For centuries, I slept beneath the earth, forgotten by your kind. But now I am awake, and I am hungry." Tom's hand gripped my arm tightly. "Robert," he said, his voice trembling but firm, "when I say run, you run. Don't look back. Don't stop. Just run." "No, Tom," I started to protest, realizing what he was planning. But before I could finish, he charged. Tom tackled the creature, his shouts of defiance mixing with its guttural screeches. They tumbled to the ground in a chaotic tangle of limbs. "Run," he shouted, struggling to pin the writhing nightmare. Every instinct screamed at me to help him, but I knew it would be suicide. Choking back a sob, I turned and ran, tears streaming down my face. Behind me, I could hear Tom's shouts and the creature's sickening laughter. Then came the sound of flesh tearing, and Tom's voice fell silent. I ran blindly through the woods, branches tearing at my clothes, roots threatening to trip me at every step. I had no idea where I was going. All I knew was that I had to get as far away as possible. Tom was gone, and I was alone. I had no plan, no thought beyond the primal need to get away. The forest seemed alive, closing in around me, its shadows reaching out like claws. I don't know how long I ran, minutes, hours. Time lost meaning in the oppressive darkness. Eventually, my legs gave out, and I collapsed against a tree, gasping for breath. As I sat there, trembling, I realized I recognized my surroundings. Somehow, in my blind panic, I had run in a circle. I was back near the cabin, not far from where I had left Tom. Guilt and fear warred within me. I couldn't just leave Tom behind, not if there was even a chance he was alive. But going back meant facing that thing again. Could I do it? Did I have the courage? As I wrestled with my thoughts, a sound broke through the oppressive silence. It was faint at first, barely audible over the pounding of my heart, but it grew clearer, a haunting, otherworldly melody, singing. The song was unlike anything I'd ever heard. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filling the air with eerie beauty. Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I found myself drawn toward it. I crept through the trees, moving as quietly as I could. As I approached the edge of the clearing, I saw something that froze my blood. The creature stood in the center of the clearing, its grotesque form now more humanoid than before. In its elongated arms, it cradled Tom's limp body, and it was singing. The melody was alien, the words shifting and twisting as though defying comprehension. Yet the effect was undeniable. As I watched, horrified, Tom's body began to change. His skin turned pale and translucent, his limbs elongating and twisting unnaturally. His chest cavity opened with a sickening crack, ribs splaying outward like grotesque petals. Tendrils of black, oily substance flowed from the creature and into Tom's body. Dawning horror gripped me as I realized what I was witnessing. This wasn't just killing. This was transformation. This was reproduction. Tom's eyes snapped open, but they weren't his anymore. They were hollow, empty sockets, just like the creature's. A scream built in my throat, threatening to burst out, but I clamped a hand over my mouth, biting down hard enough to taste blood. I couldn't let them know I was there. I couldn't end up like Tom. The creature's song swelled to a crescendo, and with one final, horrific twist, the transformation was complete. Where Tom had been, there now stood another creature smaller, newer, but no less monstrous. The original creature turned its head, its hollow eyes locking onto mine in the darkness, its terrible grin stretched wider. "Welcome, little one," it said, its voice a chorus of whispers. "The forest has been lonely, but now we will never be alone again." The two creatures began to advance, and I knew this was the end. This was how it happened to those missing hikers. This was how it would happen to me. But then, a new sound broke through the night, a sound that didn't belong in the forest. Sirens. The wailing of approaching sirens seemed to confuse the creatures. They paused, their elongated heads tilting in unison, as if listening. It was the opening I needed. I turned and ran, every muscle screaming in protest. My lungs burned, my legs felt like lead, but I pushed forward, the sound of the sirens pulling me like a lifeline. Behind me, I could hear the creatures giving chase, their wet, slithering movements closing in. Bursting through the tree line, I stumbled onto the dirt road, illuminated by flashing blue and red lights. A convoy of police vehicles was speeding toward me. I waved my arms frantically, collapsing onto the road as the lead car skidded to a stop. Deputy Sarah Collins jumped out, her eyes wide with shock as she took in my battered appearance. "Robert, what in God's name?" Her question was cut short by a blood-curdling shriek from the woods. I turned to see the creatures emerge from the shadows, their forms rippling and shifting grotesquely in the headlights. "Open fire," Sarah yelled, drawing her weapon. The night erupted in gunfire as the officers unloaded round after round into the advancing creatures. But as before, the bullets seemed to have little effect. The creatures moved with jerky, unnatural speed, closing the distance in moments. The smaller creature, the one that had been Tom, lunged at an officer, its claws tearing through his vest like paper. Blood sprayed across the side of a cruiser as the officer's scream was abruptly silenced. Chaos erupted. Officers shouted orders, their voices tinged with panic, as the creatures tore through their ranks. These were men and women who had faced armed criminals, who had seen humanity at its worst. But nothing could have prepared them for this. In the chaos, I felt a hand grab my arm. It was Sarah. Her face was pale, but her eyes were sharp with determination. "We need to go, now," she yelled over the cacophony. She dragged me to her cruiser, shoving me into the passenger seat before jumping in herself. The engine roared as she threw the car into reverse, the tires kicking up dirt and gravel. As we sped away, I caught a glimpse of the carnage in the rearview mirror. The creatures were methodical, ripping through the officers like wolves in a sheep pen. Tears blurred my vision as the sounds of gunfire and screams faded behind us. I had no idea how we were going to stop these things. I only knew that we had to try. Their inhuman strength and speed were far beyond what we were prepared to face. As Sarah floored the accelerator, gravel sprayed behind us, and we sped away from the carnage. In the side mirror, I caught one last glimpse of the creatures. They stood motionless, watching us leave, making no move to pursue. They didn't need to, they had claimed this territory. As the truck tore down the winding mountain road, Sarah's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. I stared out at the passing trees, my mind a whirlwind of horror and grief. "Robert," Sarah said, her voice trembling but resolute, "I need you to tell me everything. From the beginning." So, once again, I recounted the nightmare. I told her about the noises in the woods, the creature at my cabin, the ill-fated expedition, and Tom's sacrifice. Her face hardened as I spoke, grief and anger battling in her eyes. When I finished, the silence in the truck was suffocating. The adrenaline that had kept me going was fading, replaced by a hollow exhaustion. The weight of all we had seen and lost pressed down on me like a shroud. "We can't let this stand," Sarah said, breaking the silence. Her voice was low, steady, and filled with resolve. "Whatever those things are, they killed our people. They killed Tom. We're going to stop them." I nodded, grim determination replacing my fear. She was right. We couldn't run away and pretend this hadn't happened. Those creatures were still out there, still hunting, and they wouldn't stop. As we approached the edge of town, emergency vehicles raced past us in the opposite direction, heading toward the mountain. My stomach twisted. They didn't know what they were driving into. No amount of conventional firepower could stop those things. "We need help," I said, my voice hoarse. "Professional help. People who deal with things that aren't supposed to exist." Sarah glanced at me, understanding dawning in her expression. "I've heard rumors," she said cautiously, "about government agencies that handle unusual cases, supernatural cases. I always thought they were just stories, but after what we've seen..." She trailed off, but the implication was clear. We pulled into the sheriff's station, just as the first rays of dawn lit the sky. I stepped out of the truck, the exhaustion and trauma of the night weighing me down. The world around me felt different, changed. Sarah wasted no time. She began making calls, reaching out to contacts, and calling in every favor she could. I stood by the window, staring out toward the mountains. Somewhere out there, in the deep, dark woods, those creatures were waiting, watching, and I knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was only the beginning.